I can't hear.
If there is a delay in getting your presentation up, then at least we would have it on screen already.
Great, I'm ready to go, but just if I check by clicking share screen, it says host disabled screen sharing. So if you could enable that, I'm ready to go.
Okay, could we?
So are you guys loading the slides from locally, or does he need to share his screen? We don't have any slides.
So he needs to share his screen, so you've got to enable it.
Okay, Leon, we have somebody
but
changing that setting.
Unlock that.
So I'll let you know just in a moment once that's changed, and you can try again to see if your screen share works.
Yeah, that works. Thanks.
Okay, perfect. Do you just want to pop up your presentation quickly so we can see if it picks up on our side?
Yeah.
Great, thanks so much. And then just remember, yeah, that's perfect.
Okay.
Cool. So I think you can take it off now, and then when Sifiso starts his response, you can then just do your screen share so it's on the screen and ready when I ask your question. Cool.
Okay, stand by.
From wherever in the world that you might be, this is the beauty of technology, that we can virtually come together and have the best of live events and virtual events to bring together good conversations. We are here discussing the film industry and what that impact is in South Africa and how we can continue to engage amongst the world. I know you have tuned in, and we do apologize for starting a little bit late. We were just sorting out our tech issues to make sure that you can hear our guests that are joining us virtually. My name is Ntsiki Mkhize. I am a social entrepreneur. I'm the founder of Mentor, which is a global mentorship network supporting female social entrepreneurs. I'm a mentor, a speaker, as well as Miss South Africa's second princess for 2015. But for this evening, I will be your host. And starting out with our first panel, we'll be looking at the vision for the future. And to introduce my panelists, joining me live in studio, I have Sifiso Skechana, who is Chief Economist and Thought Leadership Executive at IQ Business. I then have Stephen Hollis, who's the IP lawyer at Adams and Adams. I also have Leila Swart, who is the co-owner of Yellowbone Entertainment. And also joining us in studio is Justine Litlow, who is an electronic communications law expert and adjunct professor for WITS at the Link Center. And then joining us virtually, we have Michael Oret, who's a film producer and MD at Spear Films. We have Bertrand Muller, who's from the Federation of Independent Filmmakers. And then finally, we have Leon Ford, who is the MD of Allsberg SPI. So I know a lot of people are probably thinking about, where is the South African film industry at the moment? What is happening with the production sector, especially looking at this post-COVID era that we're in? We're thinking about creating employment opportunities. We're thinking about economic investments. We're thinking about attracting external investment. And Sifiso, I want to start with you here. I know you are on a number of committees that have been doing tons of research, that have been advising the government. And I want to find out, how does the film sector impact on job creation, and especially when we're thinking post-COVID? What are the numbers looking like? What do we need from the sector to help us springboard and go forward?
Sure. It actually is quite a layered question in terms of what the sector actually generally means into the broader economy. But I think there are a number of ways in which we can bite at the elephant. I think the starting point is often what we talk to as multipliers, right? And if you look at a post-COVID recovery strategy, for example, for tourism, we know that in tourism, for every R1 that you spend in tourism, there's another R1.50 that goes into other sector supply chains. And this is just the supply chains, right? And so it's fuel, it's manufacturing, it's retail, etc. And when you look at broader industry, for example, that multiplier can go to about 4 times. And so it's an understanding the network effect of this particular sector. And I'll stick with tourism specifically. Pre-COVID, we had seen a tourism contribution to the GDP of about 156 billion. But when you look at the network effect and the indirect contribution of the sector, will go up to about 450 billion. And so this is the kind of sector that's got similar ancillary connections to other subsectors, particularly because of the fact that there's usually venue hire that's associated with the sector. There's vehicle, there's equipment, and all of these things that are, and then there's food as well, right? And so it is one of those sectors that touches almost every single sector in the economy. And it's certainly going to be one of those sectors, again, that we've got to make sure that as we do our post-COVID economic planning, we've got to get very specific in the way in which we are channeling, I think, investment into the sector. There are a number of challenges, of course, that we've continued to hear is that, well, what are the things that you must look at when you're trying to galvanize growth? One, there are the broader economic variables. Two is, I'd call it legislative environment. And 3, it's investment, right? And so the variables that we're talking about from an economic variables point of view, it's employment, for example. This is a sector that employs, I think 66% of the people employed in the sector are under the age of 35. And we saw the unemployment numbers coming out today looking terrible. I mean, with a labor force of about 16.5 million and 11 million people without jobs. And this is also the sector, as I said, that does employ predominantly young people. You've got to then understand that you've got to galvanize a sector to continue to operate in a way in which it can create employment. We've got other, particular economic variables, again, that speak to, we heard the president yesterday saying the borders are open, which means now we can have, I guess, some opportunity of inviting people who would otherwise come for shoots and leverage and take advantage of some of the benefits like good weather and sun staying out for much longer in terms of shooting for natural light. But then you look at the legislative infrastructure, and you've got to understand that not only is the Copyright Amendment Bill, right, in terms of there's a spirit in which the bill was intended to be amended and what it may offer for the economy. We understand that there are material challenges in how that, in its current format, how it may not fulfill the spirit of what it intended to offer, right? And over and above that, there are other legislative frameworks, POPI, Protection of Information Act, and how does information sharing, for example, impact how the industry operates in terms of how it reports and collects numbers, etc., around the participants in the industry, right? There's DTI incentive structures, right? All of those things are things that talk to the way in which this industry can operate, understanding that we've got to get to a point that when we're doing all of these master plans, how does the regulatory framework enable growth, right? We've got to look at regulation from that point of view and not from, not try to backward engineer it. And I think that becomes a very constructive conversation around legislative impetus. And then, of course, it's an understanding that there's domestic investment as well as foreign investment, right? And so how do you galvanize and how do you energize domestic investments? What are the things that are impediments to companies investing? So when you've got uncertainty from a legislative framework, it means people can't invest, right? And so which means policy certainty becomes a a key trigger in the way in which you can galvanize growth in the sector. When you're trying to get foreign investment coming into the economy, what are the things that bring parity in the way in which foreigners operate here, as well as domestic economic agents? And again, I'll make example within the Copyright Amendment Bill. In the current recommendations or proposals therein, is that foreign creative industry participants would actually benefit better than local participants because of the current stipulations that they'd be protected by international treaties. So there are a lot of things that when we look at growth in the context of the sector, we've got to understand is that yes, there's a conversation around sustainable growth metrics, inclusion, making sure that black people are participating sustainably in the sector, women are participating sustainably, young people are participating. But then also, as I said, that there's the leg with the legislative frameworks, as well as then the leg around driving investment. I think once you understand how all of those connect, we can truly get on to, I think, a more prosperous journey towards energizing growth in the sector and also respecting the role that the sector plays as a sector within the broader economy.
No, thank you so much for that. And I think that's such a good foundation to start this conversation, because there's a lot of points in there that the rest of our panelists will be unpacking. And I think it's really understanding that the film industry is not just about entertainment, but it is that multiplier effect. And it's not just a question of how do we kickstart the economy and create new work opportunities, but rather how do we create an element of sustainability throughout that. I want to bring in Leon here, and I know, Leon, you have a presentation that you want to share with us, and I think your presentation really speaks to sort of sharing some figures and giving us a lay of the land, right? But what I really want to get from you is, from a global perspective, how do you see different countries using the film industry to boost their economies and contributing to the kind of growth that Sifiso was just speaking about?
Hi, good evening, everyone, and it's good to be here and speak on this really interesting subject. I'm only going to show a couple of slides. It's not a full presentation, but I think it's interesting what you say that film isn't just about entertainment, and I think that's absolutely the case. And we've seen in recent years a number of governments globally really becoming attuned to the impact and potential that this sector has in terms of economic impact, job creation, and a range of other powerful impacts. I think particularly in the post-COVID environment, film and television production is really becoming an area of focus for a lot of areas. And just to provide some context, we did some research which we published earlier this year, and it's free to download on our website, o-spi.com, to look at, first of all, the sheer scale of this industry on a global level. And it's no surprise to anyone that we've seen a huge amount of growth. This is a real global growth sector with impacts really across the world. And we looked at the value of film and television production in 2019, which is of course pre-COVID, and as you'll see on the screen, the value of that production globally was around $177 billion US. That doesn't include things like commercials or news production. This is predominantly scripted drama. So as a direct output of an industry, that puts screen production above robotics. It puts it in 2018 terms above electric motor vehicle production. It puts it far ahead of other creative sectors like book publishing. In terms of gross value added, that takes us to over $400 billion US. And in job creation terms, we're talking about 14 million full-time equivalent jobs globally. So it's a real powerhouse of a sector. Just to show you another couple of data points very quickly, we also looked at a number of individual film and television projects to really demonstrate what happened to a national or regional economy once a project came to shoot. And the example you'll see on the screen here is a very high budget feature film. This is an actual, a real project, which we can't name, but $220 million US budget. And we worked with the producer to break down that spend week by week. And you'll see that after an 18-week prep phase, we're looking at a huge amount of spend being undertaken on a weekly basis, around about 10 million US dollars per average. And if you think about post-COVID, or as countries go back into production after COVID, the potential of these projects to deliver very, very rapid and significant direct economic impact to an economy is really, really pronounced, particularly if we think about the projects that have been able to prep during COVID and are ready to get rolling. Just finally, another really interesting data point, we also analysed a number of projects to look at how their production spend moved across an economy. And this is really interesting. And actually, only about 33% of film and TV production budgets stay within the screen production specific sector. The screen production is unique in the other areas of the economy it touches. And if we look at this diagram, this is an average across a number of productions. We see that some sectors that have been particularly hit by COVID are seeing real, real impact. So thinking about areas like hospitality, travel and transport, and so on, that huge amount of spending is really benefiting right across the economy. And just a final point that I'd like to make, and I know there's a lot to get through, is really what the previous speaker was saying about legislation and the importance of having a stable and predictable set of legislation that gives producers stability and certainty that when they come to shoot, everything's going to be okay. Because the upside is they're spending a huge amount of money, but they want to avoid any risk. One area of legislation that we've been tracking very closely is the COVID-related support or travel advisory for film and TV production. And it's interesting, and it underlines the value that so many countries put into this sector, is the number of countries that have put in special support for film and television so that production can continue. There's some examples on the screen. A number of countries have actually increased their incentive offer over the COVID period, which shows the faith that they have in film production. We've seen Australia, for example, increase the funding for its location incentive by 400 million Australian dollars. Greece has increased its incentive, as has France, and there's real support in a number of countries for this activity, which underlines the impact that I've described. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that, Leon. I think it really helps to see those figures and to really understand what the impact is, because I think oftentimes people just consider what ends up on screen. That's what you see, and that's the only associate costs that people kind of think about. But when you give us that perspective, you're able to see all the different touch points that then come together to create this industry, which is what we're here to talk about. I'd like to bring Michael in here. Michael, as a producer, from your perspective, I'm interested to find out, when we're looking at these numbers, when we're talking about this kind of investment, what does it actually take to attract this level of investment? I'm not sure if you are on mute. Okay, we're not getting Michael's audio coming through at the moment, so we'll just get the team to double check that behind the scenes. And while we get that sorted, I just want to check if Bertrand, are you still with us? Can you hear us?
I can, loud and clear.
Fantastic. Bertrand, I want to find out from you, just what we've been speaking about so far. How do we begin to drive this kind of investment? So when we're looking at people that are looking at South Africa from the outside and they're wanting to invest, but they have a number of different things that they might be considering, what are some of the key things that need to be done to drive this kind of investment?
Well, I think, first of all, it's worth talking about South Africa's kind of assets in that game, as it were, in terms of the fantastic talent pool, the qualified technicians, the very kind of diverse production sector, independent production in particular. So you're starting from, with if you don't have that asset, you don't have much else. And a fantastic reservoir of stories. I think for the rest, well, what needs to happen, I can't really, it would be a bit presumptuous for us as an international organization representing the production industry to prescribe to South Africa what may be best. But certainly you need enabling regulation that makes sense, that producers can work with, and that supports their high-risk efforts in developing and distributing their content for the national and international marketplace. And I know that Stephen will be perhaps more vocal than I could be about it, but one of the key planks of this is a copyright legislative system that makes sense, that is actually usable by the end users, and in this particular case, the producers, that doesn't impose an onerous burden on you in terms of the sort of economic pressures that you face, that takes into account the fact that this is an enterprise sector, and that gives you a chance to turn your hard work and talent into tradable assets, which you can use to leverage financing internationally and to distribute across the world. So I think somebody referenced, I think it was Sifiso referenced at the beginning, the issues around the Copyright Amendment Bill. I think I would certainly, our suggestion would be that the business needs to find an economic argument to make around this particular draft legislation, because the fight isn't over to make it make sense in terms of your priorities and your sustainability in the long run. And that perhaps we can revisit later on once Stephen will have covered some of the detail.
Fantastic, thank you so much. A point that he mentioned there was around things being onerous. And Leila, I want to find out from you, as somebody who produces your own projects, who's out there making things happen as a woman, right? Mm-hmm. I want to find out, what is your perspective on the South African film industry, your perspective on the process of fundraising to get your projects out there, but also the support that then exists as not just for economic growth, but also for transformation.
Well, I think it's very layered. I've been in the industry for 12 years now. I am youth, I'm a woman of color. So I've had on the ground sort of experience of what the challenges are and also what the potential is, I think. And if I could sum it up in terms of how I feel about this sector, it's a combination of extreme frustration and extreme excitement, because there is hardly another sector that can compare in terms of its scope for transformation. I mean, as Sifiso was saying, also over 65% of our industry workforce is under 35. But it's not easy. And the worst part is it shouldn't have to be as hard as it is. And from my perspective as a producer and a company owner, there are incentives in place to assist transformation, to assist youth, women, people of color to enter the industry, but those incentives don't work properly. Another large thing that I've had to face, I mean, I've done 5 films now in the past 3 years, and Mabata Monsho always said, one shouldn't have to sacrifice your soul for the work that you do, and it has felt like that.
You're frozen.
I was just on a production called Blood Psalms, which is one of the biggest locally made, 100% locally made series in the history of our industry, and I was the sole producer on that. And we shot it during COVID. And I went out one day onto our set, and we had employed over 1,200 people, and I couldn't pay them that week because the funds that were supposed to be incoming from the government incentives and from my partners weren't coming. So even at the crux of the height of where we're trying to repair a damaged economy, we are facing issues where we're already on the back foot. And transformation then is hindered by those economics, because I can't phone my bank and say, can you just put in 50 million so long so I can pay all of these people who need to work? And so historically, it places us in a position where transformation isn't happening as quickly as it should, I think. Skills, attention to detail in terms of skills and upskilling people has been slow, but it's mostly because the intentions are right, but the execution of all these things that have been put in place are not serving the industry on the ground in terms of that. And I'm speaking specifically towards transformation and my experience as a producer.
So it can't just be incentives for the sake of incentives. There definitely needs to be good alignment that meets the end goal and the objectives
and also
that we're
just
wanting
to pay
achieve.
attention to the sector. I feel like we're constantly saying to government, saying to stakeholders, pay attention to the impact that we could have as a sector. And it's just that attention that needs to be paid and the acknowledgement of the possibilities of what we contribute to the economy. If that could just be acknowledged and worked on, I think we could really, really change the game in terms of South Africa and the sector. I mean, California has the 5th largest economy in the world, and what is that? That's technology, that's entertainment industry. And yeah, so from my point of view, I'm working really hard to try and get those processes put in place and fixed and ironed out so that people who come after me don't have to experience it, because they don't have to.
Yeah, we definitely don't need to be experiencing that, and we do thank you for doing that work and laying the ground for women of color, for people of color, but just, I think for everybody who's part of this industry as well. I think everybody here plays their part in laying down the bricks that create the road that is going to build this industry. And Stephen, I want to bring you in here. We've heard it mentioned several times, regulation, legislation that exists, and when I'm listening to what Layla's saying, a lot of what she's talking about we assume sits within the legislative space. What kind of enabling environment do we need from a legislative regulatory perspective to allow the film industry to thrive?
Thank you, Ntsiki. And yes, what you need from a regulatory, when we speak about an enabling regulatory and legislative framework, it really is a framework that invites investment into the sector. And this is such an important time for the country. It's such an important time for creatives. Creatives were some of the hardest hit, by the pandemic. And what I like about what's happening here is we're having more of an economic discussion. And the previous speakers have all sort of mentioned that. And I like the fact that, Tafisa, that you spoke to the need, not only the potential for this industry to deliver as a key driver of economic growth, but also transformation. Very important objectives for the country and for nation building as well. So there's so many prospects of actually moving in the right direction quickly. And if we look at the numbers that Leon put on the screen a moment ago, it's absolutely staggering how much investment can actually flow into not only the film industry, but also the satellite economies that it feeds, and how many jobs it can create. And you don't actually need a university degree to work on a set, to build a set, to be a costume designer, to learn skills. But what do we need from the regulatory and legislative space is, of course, a space where investors feel comfortable to bring that high-level investment. I mean, Leon's screen spoke of one feature film that has a budget of $220 million. Now, as an intellectual property lawyer, what people who look to invest heavily in creating new works of high quality and value, what they look at, there's a number of key factors. One is certainty in law. So what you need from a film perspective and as a producer is you need to be comfortable that you can actually plan accurately a financial layout from beginning to end fairly accurately so you can work in a particular budget. You need to feel comfortable that there's an environment that allows for contractual flexibility, because each project is different. You've got different size of the budget available. You might actually there's differences between the rights models, the remuneration models, and the amount of people that you employ, whether it's a feature film, television series, animation project, or a documentary feature, for instance. So you need contractual flexibility, and you also need to have an environment where, very importantly, you are able to unify rights in the producer. The reason why that's important is our laws are quite out of date and they need to be updating. They need to be modernized, but it also needs to be recognized that works, copyright protected works, for instance, like films, are not created like they were 20, 30, 40 years ago. Most works of high quality, high value, high investment yield are actually multi-authored works where you don't have one copyright owner. You can have 20, you can have much more. You know, if you an example that just comes to mind, if you like gaming and you actually get through a PlayStation game right to the end, they're quite difficult nowadays, but I do it every now and again. Have a look at the amount of people who actually contributed to the creative process, and the same in film. Have a look at the names as they come up on the credits. So unless you can unify rights in the producer or in a central space from where work can be commercialized, it actually ups the risk profile for a particular shooting destination. And then lastly, I think an important aspect is that you need to be able to enforce your rights. If you invest a high level into a specific market and you create a product of value, you need to be able to feel comfortable that there's adequate legal protections for you to stop people who actually like piracy, combat piracy, especially online. And those 4 areas that I mentioned now, unfortunately, if we look at some of the key legislative proposals that are advanced to actually regulate the space moving forward, in the copyright bill that was mentioned a few times, it actually falls flat, unfortunately, on all 4 of those areas. It doesn't allow producers to unify rights in projects. It actually, the performance bill contains a provision that says after 25 years, each and every actor that made a sound on set gets the exclusive rights to further commercialize the film from there. So if you look at overseas markets, let's say the United States, where the life of copyright in a work is 70 years, and you now say to those businesses who want to invest here that you might lose the ability to actually further commercialize your work after a third of the lifespan that you used to, you know, in your home country or internationally, where does that place your risk profile? So that's the problem from those legislative proposals, is that it actually increases South Africa's risk profile to a point where investment might not follow. Insofar as contractual flexibility is concerned, there's a horrible clause in the copyright bill called a contract override provision that says if any benefit is afforded to you in terms of the bill, you cannot waive it even if you want to. And it applies to scriptwriters, it applies to musicians who compose for film. So for the let's say the next Black Panther movie, you're approached as a musician or a scriptwriter to do the script or the score for the film. And in return, there's an offer of $5 million. You know, that's a life-changing amount of money. That could be 100 million rand for you in the current economic climate. But in return, they want a full buyout of the rights so they can actually unify the rights into the producer. In terms of this contract override provision, it says you cannot do that deal. The local artist cannot, even if the money is there for him or her to accept, cannot accept the offer because the contract override provision says you cannot waive any of these protections. And there's a 25-year reversion right in terms of the copyright bill that says after 25 years you get your rights back if you're a musician or a writer. That sounds good for the musician or the writer, but do you see how important contractual flexibility is? There has to be an opportunity for the creative to say, I actually choose option B. And there's multiple, the copyright bill will actually turn the entire AV sector in South Africa completely on its head, because not only does it disenfranchise all producers of AV content because they cannot actually own the rights beyond 25 years. It makes it very difficult for them to do so in most productions. It also restricts their ability to choose contractually how they want to deal with their works. And then lastly, there's additional provisions which places administrative burdens on production companies and places huge risk for them. There's new statutory royalty schemes that will come in for performers. You know, any performer that steps on set that basically makes a sound now needs to share in the profits generated from a film, whether that film has made a net profit or not. So in an industry where the majority of works actually might never turn a profit, how much pressure does that put local production companies under when they've got this additional burden to start paying out money on unsuccessful projects from the past, present, and also on future? And just to cap it all off, there's a new sort of proposal that that folks need to actually report to actors before any act of commercialization occurs. It's a and the penalties for non-reporting, we don't really know who to report to or in what format, are so severe that the directors of an entertainment company or a production house can actually potentially go to jail for 5 years if not reporting to each and every actor before each and every act of commercialization. And if you think about nowadays on-demand content services, they can show millions show millions of times and thousands at the same time. So it's just unfeasible. And what it creates is an environment where, and by the way, companies can be fined up to 10% of their annual turnover if found that they don't comply with that requirement. So when the unfortunate reality is, especially if you look at international investment, international studios and international stakeholders who want to invest heavily in South Africa have people like me that they talk to on their side in their countries. And whether you like lawyers or not, they will always assess risk and what all of these provisions do. And by the way, government's intention isn't bad. Government's intention is actually very good. That's the positive we have here, is that we all want the same thing. We want this industry to take off. And I think the fact that President Ramaphosa sent the bills back to Parliament for further consideration gives us an opportunity and gives the producers community another bite at the cherry to actually constructively engage with government and to say, by the way, let's bring the economic discussion in the room, because there's been too many ideological arguments advanced by people. Government didn't know what to make of everything, and in the end, the economic argument was actually missing in it. How do we get investment in? Speak to the producers who know how to. People like Leila sitting here can tell you how she can secure this investment. Let her be some of these people who speak with government, experts from industry, captains of industry, and that's how we can actually get the legislative framework back on track. But any talk of having bills enacted now and we can fix the problems later, forget it. Investors will run for the hills if you don't give them certainty in law, if you don't make sure that they can protect their investments, and if you don't actually give them contractual flexibility and a way to unify rights in projects. Thanks.
So it's another good example of good intentions, but poor alignment, right? And we're needing not just to have the framework there, but we need clarity on how this particular thing is going to be executed. And if you don't have an idea of how you're going to execute, that also makes people very nervous. I want to bring Justine in over here. And Justine, I know you're one of the foremost experts in the country on broadcasting, media, telecommunications, and satellite law. And I'm going to read this because, it's a very long technical thing, but the Department of Communications and Digital Technologies recently published a draft white paper, which is titled A New Vision for South Africa, and it's a policy framework for audio and audiovisual content services in South Africa. So I want to get your perspective on this particular white paper. Are we going in the right direction? Is it comprehensive enough? I mean, we've heard a lot from Stephen around the various loopholes that currently exist in the copyright bill. From your perspective, where are we sitting, and is it going well?
Well, just to say that the white paper is going to be the most important policy development for the sector since the transition to democracy, and since the formation of our broadcasting environment. There are a couple of problems, though, with the white paper that I want to just talk about. First of all, it's taken 11 years from start to finish just to get where we are, and we've only got a draft. There's a very long way from a draft to actual implemented legislation. I think we're looking at another 7 years. So I want to look at the white paper, but I also want to say we have to fix what's going wrong right now with the legislation that is in force, not before, but at the same time that we're doing new policy developments. So what's the white paper trying to do? It's recognizing that there is an existential threat by the FANGs, as we call them, Facebook, Amazon, Netflix, Google, to how content is consumed and what this means for local industries. To that extent, fantastic. We all need to face that. The world is facing it. Australia is grappling with this. Europe is grappling with this. How do we, without being overly protectionist, how do we make sure that our local production sectors and our content priorities are not just completely overwhelmed? For that, it's good. Some of the proposals that they intend to have, like licensing Netflix. If you get an individual license here, you are required to have 30% local BE ownership. And no international company, particularly not a Netflix, is going to give away 30% of its shareholding, and there isn't enough money in our economy to buy a 30% stake in Netflix. Besides, and they're talking about doing things like saying 30% of the catalogue must be South African content. Now, in Europe, they couldn't get, you know, it's not nationally defined. It's a 30% Europe-wide. We're going to have to start thinking like a continent and not thinking like a tiny country stuck on the bottom of this continent. We need to dovetail our new policy with a continental free trade agreement so that we are engaging in continent-wide policy development issues on local content production. There are going to be winners and losers in that. Nigeria is going to be a winner. Kenya is going to be a winner. Are we going to be winners? We absolutely have the potential and the talent and the sunshine and the infrastructure to be winners. With these kinds of bills on the way, not just that, the Film and Publications Amendment Bill, which I think is a disaster, is going to take that potential and drive it into a brick wall. And I know we're very short of time, but I just want to talk about some urgent priorities that this sector's facing. One of the panelists on the screen, he put up this amazing shot of all the countries and what they're doing to support their film industry during COVID. Do you know what our government did during COVID? It said, even though filming could take place from lockdown level 2, it said, on the request of the broadcasters, no local content requirements will be enforced at all during the entire state of disaster. What does that do? Broadcasters asked for it, approached the regulator. Within 1 week, the regulation was passed with no consultation at all to the local independent sector. We immediately responded, had a conversation with ICASA saying, how can you do this? How can you regulate in a way that just stops our sector dead? And they said, yes, you know, actually we got into trouble from Parliament about that. Yes, we'll consider what to do. We sent those representations in July. It's November. We're in lockdown level 1. That has not been rescinded, and we haven't even had a response. We are in a catastrophic situation with our legal and regulatory environment that absolutely is supposed to do this marvelous, empowering, transforming, Black-driven, women-driven, rural, involved sector. And all it's doing, I feel like every now and then they just come off and they'll cut off a foot and then the knee, and then till you really, like the guy from Blackadder who's saying, give it your best shot, and they don't have any limbs on which to stand. It is a catastrophe.
And we do need to recognize it as that. And I do understand the white paper is still open for comment, you know, so I think this is a fantastic platform to say that if you are a producer, if you are in the film sector, and if this, not if it is, but it's definitely going to affect you, then take the opportunity to go and comment on that paper. I don't know if you can quickly advise how people go about that.
We've just got an extension on that. It seems it hasn't yet been gazetted, and the fat lady only sings when it's in the government gazette, if you're a lawyer. But we are going to get an extension until at least, I think, sometime in February. There is time. For our international friends, please consider making submissions that very clearly set out what government needs to do to support the sector with international experience behind you, because we are battling to get our government to listen to us. We're battling, and the problem is, can I just say, there's a plethora of departments all involved. There's trade and industry, there's communications, there's small business, and we've got a regulator. To put all of those groups, and we've got the NFEF funding and this person funding, to put all of those people into one room to be able to communicate with all of the people that have an impact feels like a Herculean task. We need support to make sure that we stop fragmenting this, that we bring all of the departments, all of the regulators in one room. We need to talk sense, and we need to get them to respond with one voice. And that's been the disaster, I think, around the copyright bill and others.
So it's getting them to
If that's
respond
helpful.
no, that's helpful, thanks. It's getting them to respond with one voice, but also responding timelessly with one voice. And I think this is the same challenge that's faced when we look at entrepreneurship, when we look at creating economic opportunities, is that there's government who's supposed to be helping, but it's all in different silos, and we're needing that cohesion and that co-creation to make sure that we're creating an industry that works. Michael, I want to bring you back in here. I'm aware that we did lose our feed with you guys for a little bit there, and we were going to bring you in when we were still talking about the economics and the growth aspects, and now you're coming in after we've spoken about the legal. But I still do want to get your perspective on, as a film producer, how do local film producers attract budget? How do they attract investment? And what are the logistics and the implications of everything that we've heard on local producers and being able to do that?
Okay, thanks a lot. Yeah, look, I mean, basically, pre-COVID, there was a huge new abundance of opportunity, which was created by this fight between the streamers for market share against studios, and then also a fight for all of those audiovisual broadcasters, basically, against Facebook, etc., for people's eyeballs. So prior to COVID, there was already a ramping up of production. You could see studios being built all over the world. Right now in the UK, there's 2 being built, one in London, one in Liverpool. And COVID only has increased that, because obviously more and more people are stuck at home and they're watching content. And I think there's even a shift of people, watching good content on their televisions and away from social media to a certain extent. So now, vaccine's been announced and hopefully it's going to roll out. We need to make sure that we're in the right place to take advantage of the backlog of production, which is going to have to come to fill the space that was lost while we were in COVID and while there was very little production going on. So we need to ensure that our policy, our legislation, our institutional environment is as good as it can be, that we're ready to go into this, because we need more of the productions that we've been doing, the Blood and Water, the Blood Psalms, the Trekkers, Queen Sono, Professionals, our Oscar or Lesotho's Oscar winner or entry, This Is Not a Burial, It's a Resurrection. There are lots of productions going on which show the potential of South Africans to grab the market share, which is going to become available for everybody in the world to compete with. But we need to be hand in hand with government in creating an enabling environment, which, the previous speakers have talked about the existential threats, and these are extinction events. The copyright thing that Stephen was talking about, that is an extinction event. If that was put in place, we would have no access to that market share because we wouldn't exist. So the kind of things I think would really drive our economy, one of it is studios. You know, there is a studio that's been in Durban, Video Vision, been developing for a very, very long time. If that could get going, it would transform KwaZulu-Natal and the Durban economy and the South African economy, giving a different node with a different weather system to Cape Town where there is one. So I think that would be a great investment, and I think they're presenting it to the President's Investment Council. But I know there's another development in Cape Town, Temba Sibeko, with some partners, has got a studio which we've been to see, which I think would be a great addition to the existing Cape Town studios, because the new site promises a horizon line pool and a lot of different things which the other studio doesn't have, but also the other studio has been extremely busy, so there's definitely space for it. So I'd say that as a country, we have been incredibly blessed in terms of the founding legislation and environment that we're in, because we have an NFEF Act creating a funding body, which no other African country has, and only a couple of BRICS countries have. We had a tax incentive. It used to be Section 24F, now Section 12.0. Very few African countries, well, no African countries have a tax incentive for film, and very few BRICS companies have that. The rebate is a good intervention. We have broadcasters, both public and private. Obviously, we've got institutions like the IDC and the National Empowerment Fund, which not even the UK kind of has. I think Germany has similar kind of state banks, but that's it. And then we have a regulatory authority, whether it acts well or not, and we have the potential of lotteries to give money. So those are all the positives that we have. Government has put in place a legislative and an institutional framework, which is positive. Now we need to talk about how do we get the legislation to be the best for the industry right now. And I think one of the things highlighted is that we do have, the positive is that government is obviously very animated about this sector, and that's positive. So as a result, we have this Department of Arts and Culture Audiovisual Reference Group. We have the South African Cultural Observatory Creative Industry Sector Master Plan, which is feeding into that. We have the Department of Small Business Development Creative Industries Master Plan as well. The DCDT, Department of Communications, Digital Technology, Audiovisual White Paper. And then we've got the NFEF has a new council with a new CEO. We have ongoing discussions with the DTI, and we have the copyright legislation, the FPB. So everything is hitting us at once. And I have to say, it's been very good that the IPO, which is our industry body, has actually completely transformed and to meet this challenge by ensuring that this year in our ExCo, we have a majority of Black ExCo members and 50% women, which we're hoping will ensure that in terms of our engagement with government will see us as a representative body of all producers and a trusted partner in going forward to work out what that should be. And I've just got a couple of anecdotes about how legislation was developed in the past and maybe mistakes that were made on both sides, which we need to overcome. We need to learn the lessons of the past and we need to move forward. So one of them was, for instance, when Section 24F became Section 12.0, essentially, we had been following the UK legislation. There was a tax incentive in the UK. The UK changed its legislation. South Africa, the Revenue Service felt it should do the same. So suddenly it said to us, okay, industry, let's talk. And the thing that was put on the table was a legislation similar to what they have in Jamaica, which would never have worked. And Jamaica doesn't make any films. So we clung to saying, well, let's just at least do what the UK does. And then when legislation was put in place, Revenue Service, there are obviously some hawks in the Revenue Service who just put a little clause onto it, which said that you couldn't borrow money to invest in and get an income tax deduction. And that little clause meant that particular section, that particular act became completely useless because it was not something that we had workshopped with Revenue Service. We had not been part of any of the discussions. It was just something entered at the end. and it rendered it impossible to use, and I don't know anyone who uses it. But another issue around that was, the borrowing money. Anyway, there is another problem with that act, and which is meant that it's redundant, and we've got to try and make sure that acts and legislation are actually fit for purpose. Similarly, there's been ideological approaches to acts which now need to change with the time. So, for instance, the National Film and Video Foundation Act provides for 75% of its money to go to the industry in the form of grants to produce content. And that's the kind of content that I'm talking about, the writers and directors that will create the next Peter Jackson, the next Taika Waititi, the next Gavin Hood, Neil Blomkamp, who will bring production back to us, like District 9, like Eye in the Sky, and will increase our power in Hollywood and our ownership. Now, for a long time, for good reason, when the NFVF Act was implemented, the administration felt that, well, we shouldn't be giving 75% of our money away to the industry because the industry is white and the industry is not going to help us transform. We must use as much of that money as we can internally to empower our own Black citizens. And that was correct. In my view, in hindsight, that was the right way to go. And so a lot of people came through the NFVF who then became producers, became distributors, Black people, and grew our Black companies. But now, 26 years later, it becomes more appropriate to go back to that founding legislation, which was modeled on the Australian legislation, and say, okay, well, now it's actually time for 75% of that money to go to the industry, because actually the industry is now transformed and it now has a majority of Black people, etc. So we've got to review this legislation and make sure that with producers, and since now we have SAST, which is a constituency-based organization, we have the IPO with its representativity now being majority Black and 50% women. What we're saying to government is we're ready to engage. We're a bit overwhelmed by the volume that we have because we're all volunteers, but we really want to sit down and make sure we get this right so we can really take advantage of the abundance of opportunity that's coming our way.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I know we'd like to unpack a lot of the stuff that we've spoken about this evening, because I think each thing can be a longer conversation by itself. And it's so difficult to have 7 people in one panel discussion and try to have a very extensive conversation. So I just quickly want to say, for people who are joining the stream now, you haven't missed the next session. We're going to go into that shortly. We're just still wrapping up our first panel discussion, speaking about the vision for the future. And just as an action step process thing, I'd like for each of you just to quickly share one thing that needs to happen next. So if we had to wrap up this conversation and put together a list of tasks going forward that need to happen, what is your one thing that you think needs to happen so we can create the future for the film and production industry in South Africa? So I'm going to start with you, Michael, and then I'll go to Bertrand and then Leon. So you don't have to wait for me to come back in. You can just go in that sequence. Michael, your one thing?
Yeah, basically, the Department of Trade and Industry rebate, if we could just get that so certain and so consistent that we never have to worry about it, that there's no drama, we don't have to think about bankruptcy or stress, because it's delivered in a very, very vanilla and very administratively normal manner. That's my biggest transformation.
Perfect. Thanks, Michael.
Yeah, well, I'll pick one card in the pack, because obviously you have a complex situation down in South Africa. And I'd said, coming back to what I said in my introductory and what Stephen has expanded on, I think the time has come for the producers to come together and make a case for the economic value of this sector to the South African economy, and to demonstrate the need for an enabling copyright legislative framework, which, as Stephen described, is we're pretty far from this kind of outcome yet. I think there's a tendency for lawmakers the world over at the moment to fetishize certain aspects of this, and to fetishize, for example, the plight of individual talent, and to refuse to look at our industry as an ecosystem. And I think it's very much focused on disposition that are about sharing the revenue from film and television, but not really asking the question of how these revenues are made in the first place. And back to Stephen's point about how difficult it is actually to bring the film to profit. So that would be my choice.
Thank you, Leon.
Thanks. Yeah, I would just echo the comments that were made about the opportunity that South Africa has, both economically and culturally. There's, as other panelists have said, there's a very significant talent base and base of expertise there, and I think it's important to understand that this is a global growth industry and provides an opportunity to create jobs and create economic impact. And, one of the key pillars in achieving that is having, as Bertrand says, a legislative framework that is stable and that works for the industry. And that would include, obviously, incentives as well.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Coming into our studio for our panelists here, we'll start with you, Stephen, and then come through this way. What is your one thing, Stephen? Just one thing.
Only one. Yes. So I would say, government can only legislate as well as it understands your sector and your subsector. And in the film industry, we've seen that there's so many different industries, and the next panel, the producers are going to illuminate that even more. But I would like to see more of a, let's call it a call to arms in the producers community to say, let's put our differences aside where the differences, associations have differences, may have differences. Let's actually see that when we stand together and engage government, we're more effective. Let's understand that we need to find a solution that doesn't benefit one or two stakeholders, but everyone. And I love the comments made so far about the need for a business case, the need for more of an economic argument. The time whenever you've got discussions on copyright, you quite quickly have people bringing ideological, commercially untested arguments. The time for that is over. The time for that is over now, especially when we're in this dire economic state, and the massive promise that this industry holds to actually lift not only the film sector but the country out of that. It's almost like a national duty for us all to get it right. And people like Safiso needs to be in these conversations as well with film producers, economists, film producers, government, and experts, filmmakers like Leila, who can actually say, this is what it takes to bring the productions here. This is how much investment I can bring if you help us with incentives, with production funding, etc. So it's going to take a collaborative effort, but the good news is we can do it.
We definitely can do it. The man who's putting together the economic arguments. Safiso, what's your one thing?
Sure. Just a quick response also to the example Prof made about the 30% BEE requirement on the likes of Netflix. We've actually seen government respond to a similar challenge in automotive, and eventually they realized that a BMW won't adhere to a 30% BE requirement in a localized context. And what they did is that actually they did the right thing, which was actually saying, well, we need original automotive part makers to be localized, to service your dealerships, etc. And that now was the real transformation. And so I think what it means is that there is innovation in the way in which we think about transformation sometimes that can be built into the legislative frameworks. But quickly, I think for me, the real opportunity then is localization of trade, right? We've got the Africa Free Continental Trade Agreement, and what does it mean for us to truly take advantage of the opportunities that presents, and to truly inbreed a truly African creative and cultural industries?
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Justine?
I would get them all in a room for a very long time. Seriously, at
Just
least
lock
a
the
week.
door. Yeah.
Lock the door. We need the best people, the best producers, the best lawyers, all the right government people. So, because they all say yes, but. Everyone needs to be together with a stake in this to fix it once and for all. If we don't fix it once and for all, the future's going to look like the last the last 10 years have done. All in a room, all together, committed to fixing it.
100%. Leila, your one thing?
I 100% agree with that. I think there's a disconnect. I think that's the most frustrating thing between producers themselves, between the industry, between government, between all the stakeholders. We're not all on the same page. And I think it's very frustrating when you are struggling with something but you don't know who to articulate it to. And I think that's what this sector really has been. It's like we can't fix anything because nobody understands each other or understands the bigger picture. So yes, all in a room. I'm tired of having no limbs.
Definitely. We want to make sure that you have a leg to stand on. Thank you so much to our panelists joining us virtually and to our in-studio panelists for sharing your insights. Really great topics, great comments, great points. And I really would encourage further conversation beyond this. And I think the conversation needs to happen with the people that sit outside this room, because you guys are constantly having these conversations in your workplace. So to really have the right kind of engagement that we need to make the transformation, to make it stick. So thank you so much. That's our wrap up on our first panel discussion, A Vision for the Future. We're going to take a quick break so we can get in our new panelists and give you at home a chance to just take a body break. And we'll come back with our second panel discussion, listening to South African producers and having a dialogue with them. And before we wrap up this panel discussion, I just do want to say a quick thank you to the Independent Producers Organization, the Independent Black Filmmakers Collective, the Commercial Producers Association of South Africa, the DFA and Animation South Africa for supporting us and putting this together. And then a big thank you to the Academy of Sound Engineering that are hosting us today. We really appreciate you coming together to make sure that these crucial conversations happen. We'll be back in a few minutes.
implications of, no, that's why you're last. Second, third last, okay. Because then, she's missing. Okay, sorry, just give me a second.
Do we have someone from DFA?
Yes, she was coming in virtually.
Oh, she's virtual.
Which of the mics actually speaks to
Okay, no,
Cynthia?
it is you next. So
It's
then,
me.
yes, it is you. So then, Nick, I'm going to ask you, based on what we've said, what are then the implications for animation? So like considering the fact that people, now we're going beyond people, right? It's all the people behind the scenes that are creating the animation. So what is that? The broader implication when we then move into the animation sector.
Okay.
And then Simpire's going to come in, and I'll be asking.
Broader implications from what, the copyright point of view, or
So whichever point of view you want to take,
Sure.
and I think part of that is to say we don't. I don't know if there's a fixed thing on where animation sits. And
Yeah.
I think when we met the other week, that was like one of the
Yeah.
so like I think maybe it's to say this is what first we need to think about when it comes to animation, and where animation the line
Sure.
thing based on that. These are then the implications. And then Simpira is going to come in to speak about. Simpira, can you hear me? Hi. Oh, no, she can't hear me.
Is that a she?
Yeah, Simpira girl, lady.
I think
Is that Simpira Mother, or is it KZN?
Don't know.
Hi, Simpira. Simpira, can you hear me? Okay, I'll.
No, I mean, I must know of them.
Oh, is it on?
It is on. Yeah. Okay, I'll get Simpira in, but then I'm going to wrap up the panel discussion with Pumla, and then Pumla, from you, I'll just be asking based on what everybody said from a legal perspective, feasible, what's practical, what's not practical, and what to be thinking about overall. And then depending on if we have time or how we're doing on time, Bobby, I might come back to you and ask you about the impact of the overall regulation. What the impact of
Department of
regulation.
Labour, are we going to do that? That's not in the combo.
That is so what impact will over-regulation of labour laws have on the film industry?
Yeah.
Unless you want me to ask you both questions in one go, and then you can answer both.
No, because I think they're quite different. See how we go, and then if there's space at the end.
Or would you like me to ask you that one first?
No.
Okay.
I gave a whole lecture to the financial directors at the agency, so I feel a bit more confident about that.
And then, Ketsiwe, depending on time, I'll come back and ask what can producers do to align themselves in order to benefit from the various opportunities. Cool. Is everybody comfortable?
Yes.
Yeah, different energy.
It's actually quite nice how we don't have to see ourselves, because that's very frequent, isn't it?
It was
Like see
catchy.
a screen with
Yeah.
your face looking back. You
Yeah,
don't
yeah.
see
It was
so
distracting Stephen quite a bit, I saw it.
But where is it?
It's right there.
Yeah, I just kept staring at
It's
it.
been on TV.
Yeah.
Anybody would like a disinfectant wipe?
I made a note.
Once your mic is put on?
Focus on the camera.
Anyone?
Just stare at the light and find yourself. It's all you
Ah,
don't
sure. Where does it go?
Okay, it goes on your
Anybody
shirt
want a disinfectant wipe?
So like just
For
put it
giggles.
While your
here.
cameras? Well, I mean, if you're going to pass your
have to
mics
tape it on.
around.
Oh,
so
gotcha, cool.
Let me just
Alright.
grab it from here. and put it like
Okay then.
that. This, like a little
Very reduced to
Is that where-
that side.
Yeah.
Thank you.
and then please may hold this.
You don't
Am
get
I
in front of
passing a
the
mic
camera.
around?
Sorry?
Am I passing a mic around? No.
It's right next to a
I'm
mic,
right,
so
I'm
you
right there,
usually-
okay.
Oh, cool. That's good.
Yeah.
The three of us.
Okay, cool. Hop along.
If we're battling to hear you,
No.
just go to the back
I
side.
don't ever want to look.
Like,
You
okay.
can grab
It's
the
like
mic.
a
Kind of virtuous.
Get into it before you get.
It's like looking in a mirror. It's like
Okay, that's good.
Looks like we
so
did
how long
run
do
those
you,
on like dry
do you guys
tissue,
rent out
right?
these facilities?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
We've rented here since
You rent out, I mean, do you sublet it?
Oh, I did want to speak. I wanted to make an announcement about that if we've got
Yes.
some time.
Let's not bother with that.
We don't. We're
So
not in
can
the-
I just have one of those?
Also, you don't want to start
Yes,
the
sure.
conversation
No,
by
just
like,
here,
you know,
just
wiping.
just
Yeah,
maybe
imagine being
just
pedantic and
on your-
taking like
on your second
30
button,
seconds.
and then just
If
tape
we
it up
do
on the
this,
tape.
Yeah.
And, and
then we kind of like, we're
Since
sorted.
you're in black,
Done.
it doesn't
Ready.
matter. Just
Gotcha.
since where am I doing it?
yeah,
And
just
then we
there.
can get rid of
And
it.
then
Yes.
some tape.
Do you want me to put it through?
Yeah. Well,
So
you
just-
can put it on the inside of your. Yeah.
Oh, okay, so where's the tape?
No, on your
Sorted.
shirt.
Oh, we've got an extra.
And then please just
Fantastic.
Oh, okay, sorry, I'm just used to the clips normally.
yeah, sorry about that. Okay, when it's on,
Yeah, sure.
and
That-
you can hold that open next to you.
So I just hold this all the time.
Answer your question.
Yeah.
We only ask for donations for our work study program,
Okay.
which goes to our students because they're working here
So
after
I'm just
hours.
asking because I've got a friend who needs to shoot.
Ladies, I have a
She's a
secret mic
DJ,
to my
but she needs to shoot
parent.
a set.
I'll give you a card when we're done.
Perfect.
And
Okay.
we'll chat it up.
Great.
Excellent. So we'll be on air in about half a minute.
Oh.
Are you ready?
Yeah. Thank you. Hi, Cynthia, can you hear me? Hi, Cynthia, can you hear me? I'm not sure if you are on mute. Do you hear me in the studio?
I can hear you now.
Awesome. Hi, Superior. Welcome. How are you?
I'm great, thanks. How are you doing?
I'm good, thank you. So just to let you know the flow of the conversation, if you're wanting to keep your video off, I'm going to start with panelists video, and then I will come to you. So I'll address questions to 4 of the panelists in studio, and then come to you.
And wrap up with our legal expert.
All right. Cool. So I don't have to show my face then. Thank you very much.
Yeah, for now you can keep your camera off just to save some bandwidth, and then also just keep yourself on mute. But then when I do come. Thanks.
Hi, hello and welcome back. We are continuing with our conversation looking at the film production industry in South Africa. We had our first panel discussion where we spoke about the vision for the future, and we had inputs from our panelists looking at the economic implications and opportunities for the SA film producers industry. And then we also looked at the legislative and the regulatory framework. So coming into our second panel discussion now, we're going to be hearing from representatives from various film producing associations and finding out their perspective of literally what's happening on the ground, but what they want to see in the industry. So joining me in studio for our panel discussion is Thandi Davids, who's the newly elected co-chair of the IPO, and she's also an executive producer at Storyscope. We also have Ntsiki Mkhize, who's representing Independent Black Filmmakers Collective. And then we have Nick Kloot, who is the national chair for Animation South Africa. And then joining us virtually, we have Ntsiki Mkhize, who's a filmmaker, and he's also with the Documentary Filmmakers Association. And then next to me here in studio, we have Bobby Am, who's the executive officer at Commercial Producers Association. And finally, we have our legal expert, Phumla Nobantu Mfeka, who's an entertainment industry lawyer and is representing Mfeka Attorneys. Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining me in this panel discussion. Bobby, I want to start with you, not to put you on the spot, but we heard a lot from our first panel on the legal implications, the economic opportunities, and so forth. And I want to find out from you, what are some of the unintended consequences of the Copyright Amendment Bill for commercial production and advertising?
Thanks very much. Yes, it's quite interesting because we are obviously on the advertising side of film. So as the Commercial Producers Association, we kind of are in a strange position in that we sort of span the film industry and the advertising industry. So it's quite unique from that perspective. And over the last few months, we've been doing a lot of discussion and a lot of thinking about how the Copyright Amendment Bill and the Performance Protection Amendment Bill actually impact on the commercial production sector and also on the advertising industry. And I must say, it's been quite a shock because initially when this legislation was coming through, we didn't think it had too much of an impact on us because there was a lot of discussion around, the impact that it had on feature films and publishing and music. So that was really where a lot of the emphasis was sitting. But I must say, as we looked into it more deeply, we became quite alarmed, basically, by the impact that it does have on commercial production and the advertising industry. And we have been chatting a lot to the ACA, which is the Association of Communication and Advertising, about the impact of this bill on our industry. So we really want to get more involved. We've joined up with the Copyright Coalition, which has really been a positive move. and we've started to engage and, you know, really put our position as an industry forward, which I think has been a very important step for us. So just to speak a little bit more about how it actually impacts us, you know, there's been a lot of discussion about, you know, we've heard about fair use, we've heard about various concepts, the Marrakesh Treaty. One feels quite overwhelmed by all the information that's coming out about this bill, and it's quite difficult to understand as a layperson because there are so many layers to it, and there's so many different implications for different industries. So we took a look with the assistance of Stephen to say, you know, where do we really stand and what are the issues for us? And what we found, just speaking on behalf of the CPA first as commercial producers, the biggest impact comes in the way that we actually contract talent. Obviously, the fact that talent will now be entitled to a portion of royalties under the Copyright Amendment Bill if it goes through is a concern. And I think the biggest problem is that no one has really, you know, scoped out the different industries to say, how is this actually going to impact on you? I know that impact assessment studies have been done in certain sectors, but there hasn't been anything in advertising to say, what is the impact, you know, of these decisions that are contained in the bill, the proposals, on the advertising space. So the first thing we noticed is that there's really very little detail about how things will work. And I think the lack of detail actually creates a lot of unintended consequences going forward. Because at this stage, one doesn't really know. So for instance, when it comes to performers working in the audiovisual space, and I think it's, I stand under correction 8A, what it basically says is that, you know, the royalties will be calculated. Either they'll be negotiated or they'll be calculated on the commercial exploitation of the work. So what does that really mean? How do you actually quantify the commercial exploitation? It's probably a lot easier in a film, for instance, because you can look at box office figures, but in a commercial, what would that be? Would it be the number of product that the commercial actually sells? Would it be you know, the markup that the agency passes on to their client? How do you actually quantify that? And then the next problem is it obviously refers you to the structure that will basically be set up to collect these royalties. And how does that work? Where's the detail that actually sets out, you know, how that will actually happen, and how will we go about interfacing with, you know, those sorts of regulatory authorities? So the scary thing is, as I think Stephen mentioned earlier, it's really difficult to plan around that, because as a production company, how do you say to an agency or a client, these are the costs that you're actually in for? Because those costs are not specified at this stage, so you cannot plan. And this goes both to our local industry, which is very robust, obviously, and to the decisions made by local clients and agencies. And it also goes to our service industry, which is very, very busy. And, you know, how do international clients plan? So now suddenly you have to say to your international client, well, not only are you paying a day fee for your talent and quite a comprehensive usage fee, you also now have to pay a royalty. And how does that work? Well, the biggest problem is you can't explain it to them, and you can't tell them how much it's actually going to be. So, you know, I know that there's been a lot of pushback from the actors who say, well, you know, we should be paid these fees and we due them. You know, I think that's a separate debate, but I think what really it comes down to is we need clarity on these issues and how this will actually work before we can move forward and actually see whether this is feasible or not. And there needs to be a discussion with different industries about the impact that the copyright bill is going to have on them, rather than this sort of blanket assumption that I think government often likes to make, that all of our industries are the same. And as we know, even in the film space, I mean, if you're a commercial producer, what you do is very similar to what a long-form producer does, but it's also very different. And there are very different nuances that I think are being overlooked. So that's of great concern. And then in the advertising space, it goes even further, because to my knowledge, the thing that impacts us greatly is performers. But if you go into the advertising space, it opens up. Suddenly, an advertising agency wants to commission a jingle from a musician. Now there's a question mark over how that royalty is paid as well. It goes to someone who illustrates, for instance, a logo, or you know, designs a brand or a brand identity. Where's the impact on that? If you're doing a photographic still shoot, you have the same problem. The photographer or the copywriter needs to be remunerated. And how does that work? So it creates just a huge amount of uncertainty. And you know, our concern is that that uncertainty is going to make people think twice, because as the last panel mentioned, it creates a lot of additional risk. So our concern is that actually local advertising agencies and clients might just decide, you know what, because there's so much uncertainty, maybe we should look elsewhere and actually take our own local production offshore, which would be devastating for our industry, our production companies, and all of our suppliers who rely on this industry, you know, for their livelihood and for their lifeblood. And then from the service perspective, you know, our clients love coming to South Africa because I don't think I need to tell all of you, we know what's great about South Africa. We all know what it has to offer. But suddenly clients are saying, is this such a good idea? We don't know what we're actually in for. We don't know how these amounts are going to be calculated. We don't know when we're going to have to pay them. So it's just yet another issue that's going to put people off, on top of a whole lot of other legislative issues that are off-putting. So I really think that it can have a very significant impact on the advertising sector, and this is why we want the advertising sector to get more involved, you know, to have a voice in this whole process. But I'd really like to appeal to people. You know, I know there's a lot of what I call sort of populism going on around this issue, where, you know, these sort of slogans come out and very simplistic proposals are put to actors. There isn't a lot of detail, and I would just really like to appeal to people is to really look at the legislation, and it's difficult to read because it's long and, you know, you really have to kind of come with a legal approach. But I think if more people understand what the unintended consequences are and can actually realize how this could really, really be bad for our industry and how it could actually close production companies down, I think there would be a lot more awareness, so that I get that it's appealing to listen to someone who says, you know, you should be a royalty holder or a rights holder. But the reality is we've got to look at the big picture, and I think that is absolutely key here if we are to actually, you know, preserve the advertising and the commercial production sector of the industry.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of implications when you zoom into that bigger picture.
Totally.
I want to find out from you, Kitty. We heard the first panel speak about the risks. We heard Bobby now as well also identify some of those risks. The flip side of the coin, right? On the other end, for people who are like, but South Africa is so great, I want to go, right? What are some of the opportunities that exist for the local AV sector, as well as for investors who are wanting to come in and produce in South Africa?
Well, I think everybody knows that we're a really robust country in terms of the audiovisual sector. We have the skills, we have the facilities, we have the locations, we have so many things that are going for us that I think that because 2020 has been a bit of a disaster, we have to start thinking about how do we start persuading people from a positive perspective about how do we re-examine the legislative environment. So we really need to say that we have all this stuff, and it's great stuff, and we can grow our pie. In our organization, there's been a growth in people seeing opportunities as co-producers, people producing not just internally. I mean, I think the internal production space has kind of shrunk and grown. I don't want to speak about that because that is not good news. I want to speak about what are the opportunities for us to look as become global players. And I think that there are people in our organization who are working with Germany, who are working with Canada, who are working with France, who are working with the UK, and saying, if we make something, it's not our fault. Sorry, I'm not good with the mics. It's not our fault that the RAND is a bit of a disaster, but it's an opportunity because people can see this environment as somewhere to come and spend their money because our RAND is not doing so well. But so that means that we can, if our RAND, well, we can make more for our bang for our buck. And I think that the other opportunity is to look at the legislative environment and say, we are definitely going to come through in terms of the copyright bill because logic has to prevail, right? There's no way that the copyright bill can be, can kill the whole of the creative sector, right? We can't allow that. So what we need to do is to accept that we're gonna prevail, and we're gonna we're gonna have a positive outcome. So we're gonna do that, and we're gonna then also find ways of creating funds, because if we can create funds, if we can create money within the economy so that that we're not only just about relying on government, we need government. Government mustn't go away. Sorry, it's not good to cough.
It's okay, sometimes you get a frog in your throat. It's a non-threatening frog.
Yeah, it's a non-threatening frog. So we mustn't allow government to move away and say that they're not going to be involved in the sector, because they actually benefit. I think somebody should go and I should or do something, because I'm not winning.
Yeah, no, sure. We'll give you a moment to clear your throat, and we'll come to Thandi. I think that's the perspective maybe from the investors to say, there's still opportunity here. But from the producer side, I'm thinking about producers who are listening and are thinking, should I be doing this? Should I still have my heart in this? Should I still have my pockets in this? What are the shared opportunities and challenges?
Well, I think we're starting to tell our stories and starting to tell them bravely. The opportunities for us to showcase who we are globally. I think that, seeing our stories told on Netflix and having those accessible by everyone across the world is an incredibly wonderful thing, and shows that our stories can travel and travel globally. And I think from that perspective, there's really an opportunity for us to look at how we can take those stories out to the rest of the world and do it in every way possible. It doesn't have to be in English language. More and more people are used to watching subtitles, for example. So let's start focusing and concentrating on producing in indigenous languages and taking those stories out from younger producers with different types of stories. I think also moving on specifically from stories that I think on some levels we've been very stuck on telling our past, but starting to engage in where we are at this point in time and looking to the future and looking at genres we potentially haven't really kind of followed through on. I don't think we've had a very big South African science fiction film, for example. Is a time that we start looking at different kinds of genres we start investing in from that perspective. So really understanding our stories do travel, that it's not just stories that come from a particular genre that travels, but they're traveling more globally and trying to understand how we take those stories out. I know the documentary people will talk about the ability to be able to do documentary series, for example, that travel and makes documentary more accessible from a television perspective. These are key things for us. I think we do need to learn as we move along now and move away from just looking at us being a very television-focused environment as producers, starting to resource ourselves up a little bit more in terms of film and becoming more independent in terms of that. We need to start learning how to be proper producers, I think, which is a key thing as well. I think our reliance very often as independent filmmakers on either commissions or on getting money out of government is problematic. It's not going to grow us as an industry altogether. We need to learn how to go and find other funding sources. We need to go and find out how we can get money from the private sector and get that money in so we own our IP. I think the key thing for us is owning our own IP moving forward and being able to exploit that IP. And doing that in a way that from a business perspective and from a creative perspective in terms of how we script writing, what genres we're focusing on, who our audiences are, understanding you can produce for both a local audience and for an international audience. And I think that that's the place we have at this point in time as producers, is the world is opening up to us. How do we make sure that the legislative framework does that, but also resourcing and training ourselves? If we understand that our writers are mainly television writers, can they write for film correctly? No, they can't. Let's look at how we resource them up so that they can become film script writers. These are the kind of things that we need to be looking at this point in time to move us forward as we go into the future of the sector.
Definitely. So for a growing sector, there's new opportunities for new skills, but also upskilling people already within the sector. Nick, I want to bring you in here representing Animation South Africa. Firstly, just to understand, we've heard all the different touch points that exist just in the film industry. What are the different touch points for animation? What does that look like? And just if you can sort of position animation for us, and then from the animation perspective, what are some of the opportunities and challenges that exist for you guys?
We're quite similar to live action, but there are some very important distinctions that need to be made. And it's what Bobby was talking about earlier in terms of making a policy framework and legislative environment that can accommodate all the different nuances within the creative and cultural industries. And that's why it's so very complex, because we are so varied. Even within the same industry, we have different business models. And many people don't even appreciate that. So we are working in short form, like what you guys do at the CPA, but we're also working in long form, animation. So we're producing features and series, but we're also producing ads. The vast majority, the bulk of all commercial activity in animation is commercial and corporate in nature. And the truth is that for the most part, what we do is we get voiceover artists to actually bring to life whatever we need to bring to life. And when they loan their voices to these projects, that that you're referring to earlier is a cause for concern for us in terms of the Copyright Amendment Bill. Because when they give their performance for that piece, the legislation as it's currently drafted will mean that we are unable to pay them a buyout fee for their work. We would need to pay them royalties on an ongoing basis, which is very challenging given that these kinds of things come from a very finite and predefined marketing budget. And then once that's expended, there's no more expenditure, so there's no more earnings. But you can always argue about the exploitation, because when you create an ad, you're selling products and services. But when you do that, that is supposed to be the full encapsulated scope of the performer's contribution to the project. But if it isn't, and they're expected to continue to pay royalties on top of that, which, by the way, is just expanding on what you were talking about earlier, is apparently gross profits. This is how the whole thing is supposed to be. So it's permitted expenses after revenue, you know. So this is apparently how it's going to be calculated. And the truth of the matter is that they're simply not going to bring the work to us in that case. It's going to deter and disincentivize investment and service opportunities in animation. And this is something, another cause for concern is that they have this list of general and very specific exceptions to copyright protections and various limitations. And in general exceptions, it explicitly says cartoon and caricature. And in common parlance and in trade talk, cartoon is interchangeable with animation. So does that mean that animated works are not going to be protected? And what about the educational content that we produce, possibly PSAs, that is educational in nature? Does that mean that it doesn't employ, they not enjoy copyright protection either? So all of these for us are major causes for concern. I could probably wax lyrical, but I think let's move on. Yeah.
No, thank you for that. Kitsy, I want to come back to you. So maybe if you could just wrap up on that previous point, and then if you can just add to that then, for how do producers then align themselves to be able to take advantage of the opportunities that exist?
Well, I think that what we need to do is to really look at where are the places where there are opportunities. And I think we need to, first of all, I was talking about creating a fund, and I think that if we see that that there's in the white paper they want to fund the SABC through license fees, I think there's a greater opportunity, which is a much broader opportunity for all the players in the game, rather than just one particular player, is that we create a fund where all this money goes to create content, so that if let's say we have something where a project with 30% which is coming from a rebate, 30% which is coming from a co-producer or an international partner, and we're able to find at least 20% from a fund, which helps us close the funding down, we're able to then create a very functional and lucrative and working industry, because that's what we need to do, because we have that opportunity to do that. And if we start to think that we can divert that money, which government is saying must go to this, I think it's a deep dump, but to go to this fund, yeah, to fund the SABC, I think that's not a clear opportunity. A clear opportunity is to say, how do we use that money in a collective way where everybody wins, where not only broadcasters win, but producers win, international players win, we're all participating in something. So I think that's one of the things that we really should be fighting for, is a much bigger fund which is enabling the industry from very many places. And I think that if we can do that, we will change it. And I think we've got to look at all the pieces of legislation that are facing us and say, where are the opportunities in changing the minds of
the people who've put those bills are, if there's a problem, or there's in some of the bills that actually great things that are present. So how do we start to talk about those things rather than just the negative?
100%. Thank you so much for that contribution. I want to go to our panelist who's joining us virtually, Simpiwe. You know, we've heard some talk from Bobby highlighting the advertising space. We've heard some talk from Nick, you know, and highlighting some of the implications for animation. And I think there needs to be a distinction as well with understanding that documentaries also sit in their own unique space. And I want to find out from you, Simpiwe, how do you envision how we begin to then build a sustainable business model that works for documentary films?
I think that's exactly the challenge, really. I mean, to come up with a business model that works for, for documentary films. You know, for a long time, documentaries have been actually seen as the poor cousins of the fiction category. And in as much as we find it much easier to actually access funding from government bodies for documentaries, but we find that actually documentaries are measured, I mean, on the same standard as fiction films, which is not the case. I mean, when you apply for development funding, the expectations that you would actually have a structured documentary by then, whereas, by the nature of documentaries regress. As you develop it, new voices, come into being, and you spend more time in researching your subject. So there's quite a challenge in coming up with a real, sustainable, business model, especially in an environment where you find, that we actually have a dysfunctional kind of public broadcaster, where at this stage we actually don't even have a prominent kind of strand where we can say we find, documentaries. So if we actually have to watch documentaries in South Africa, you probably have to go to streaming kind of platforms rather than from your public broadcaster. So, I mean, to really come up with a sustainable model, we would actually need platforms that will know that there's some guarantee that, the content that is actually being produced by documentary filmmakers can be seen by people. And so, I mean, looking at also the kind of the legislative environment from a copyright perspective, I mean, the general feeling from documentary filmmakers is that we are actually quite excited about some changes that can be proposed, especially whereby we can actually borrow some works from other filmmakers and use them in creating new works of documentaries. And obviously works, I mean, where everybody agrees that, a reasonable kind of use of other people's sources should actually, be encouraged, and then new content actually is created. But we also, I mean, see that, documentaries become an easier kind of way for emerging filmmakers. I mean, it's less risky. I mean, if you look at it from a cost perspective, yes, we do find, very expensive documentaries that are done over a long period of time. But the reality is that, you are able to actually, make small kind of documentaries, which makes it easier for emerging filmmakers to really practice their craft and be able to perfect it. And also bring diversity of voices. I mean, we heard in the earlier panel that, about 65%, of the working force actually is youth. And where do youth really find that space to express their craft? When actually, if you go for a feature film, there's 101 requirements that are needed from you in terms of your experience. And if you are really recent from a film school, where do you get that experience? And we feel that the platform is actually quite ripe for emerging filmmakers in the documentary space. And perhaps also I've been touching on developing our craft from a human resources perspective. We could actually see things made a bit easier also from a SETA perspective for small production companies to be able to host interns into their productions. And we know that in other sectors, that is actually done quite easily. But for a small company to really host an intern, they have to, fill 101 kind of application forms for them to be able to really be supported by SETA to be paying for the intern there. So at the moment, I mean, as we're dealing with the kind of developmental kind of space, so there needs to be some relaxation and understanding of the capacity that exists within documentary filmmaker space, because those normally are not very big kind of organizations. And also, I mean, there's been this kind of notion where documentaries have been painted with the same brush that, you know, they're all about protest, you know, they're all about, you know, bringing authorities, I mean, to account. Yes, that is great, I mean, to do, but also we need to be seen to be producing celebratory kind of documentaries, which may not actually have any dramatic moments, you know, as it is expected mostly by funders, but really reflecting on the beauty of our culture. And those tend to be actually sidelined, you know, at the expense of those, you know, kind of dramatic documentaries. And that's the space that we really need to look at in making sure that we actually have a number of documentaries on our platforms. And perhaps, you know, lastly, I mean, it's about also the space now open by the big organizations, you know, to invite documentaries to be put in there. But with those big players, again, it feels like, you know, the emerging filmmakers are always kind of, you know, subjected to the same kind of standards whereby they're unable to really make deals, at least, I mean, as equal partners with those platforms in negotiating, you know, the right kind of revenue for the documentaries that they spend their time making.
Yeah, thank you so much, Imperial, for all those fantastic points. I want to come back into studio, Bobby, and ask you, what is the overall impact of the regulation when we're looking at labor laws and that impact, you know, within the industry as a whole?
Yeah, I mean, the previous panel spoke a lot about, you know, the challenges that are caused by overregulation and an unfriendly legislative space. I mean, I think the biggest thing is that, you know, all producers look at risk, as they said earlier, and everybody wants to assess how successfully and how flexibly can I make my production. I think the biggest mistake government is making is that they are comparing the film and the creative sector to other industries like manufacturing or farming. They're not realizing that what we do is a very dynamic and creative process that doesn't work according to fixed schedules or, you know, very rigid timelines. So one of the developments recently on top of the copyright and performance protection development is a move by the Department of Labour to now look at everybody working in the industry and potentially move towards reclassifying our very large group of independent contractors or freelancers, as we refer to them in the industry, both, so this would be crew members and your actors and your models and your extras, rather than looking at them as independent contractors, as looking at them as employees. And I think that is substantially, has the potential to change the way that our industry operates, because for many, many years now we've been working in a particular way. And I think what government is not looking at is that we are not a permanent job. Look, obviously we are. Some soapies, yes, someone will be employed for 2 or 3 years, but certainly in the commercial space, and I would imagine with documentaries and in film, like a feature film, you know, it's a project. You're coming in, you're making a feature film or a TV commercial, you're not working permanently. So I think that changes things. I think the other challenge, particularly with COVID, is there is very little work at the moment, and we know that all the production companies, whatever genre they come from, are all under incredible pressure to actually make sure that production happens. So I think what's happened is, because there is this frustration by the lack of work, there's a feeling from some people in the industry that we need to get more out of the little bit of work that there actually is. So the gut reflex almost is to actually create a more regulatory and legislative environment, thinking that, okay, if we can do that, we can get more and we can become more secure. But actually, the reality, it has the opposite effect, because it strangles production. It says to investors, it says to clients, actually, the framework is much more difficult now. There are many more hurdles that you actually have to overcome. And then people start to look elsewhere. And, you know, my view is that there has to be flexibility in the film industry. There has to be the ability for people to contract, to have the freedom to actually contract. And it's interesting because we're not the only country that's grappling with these issues. I mean, in Los Angeles, of all places, there's been legislation passed recently that recognized all gig workers, as they call them in the States, as employees instead of independent contractors. And a lot of the motivation around that was very similar to the motivation here. You know, people need to be more protected, they need to be more secure in their workplace. And there was actually a vote, ironically on the same day as the recent elections, to see if people agreed that gig workers, particularly not actually working in the film industry, but for companies like Uber and Lyft, should have more freedoms. And what they found is that a lot of gig workers actually enjoy that status. So I think here there's very much a sort of stigma, that if you're independent, you must come from a very disadvantaged position. But there, it's almost seen as actually, it's quite a prestigious, opportunity in terms of employment, because you get to set your own hours, you get to decide on the projects that you actually take on. So there's a lot of freedom involved in that. And I think a lot of people working in the film industry really like that freedom. People who work in this industry are not people who you would find working in insurance companies or in the corporate sector, because the thing we all have in common is that we're essentially free spirits. There's a lot of creativity around. So I think what's happening is that, government is listening to a few stakeholders here or there, and they're making these decisions, but again, they're not being thought out. So with the labor issue, exactly the same as, copyright amendment, no research has been done on the issue. Nobody's actually said, well, let's do a risk assessment. Let's see the knock-on effect. It's all been pushed through in the middle of COVID, which is, let's face it, like the end of the world in a lot of respects for our industry. We're still wondering, are we actually going to recover from what we've gone through over the last 9 months? So for government to suddenly be making aggressive moves to pass new legislation that puts even greater pressure on filmmakers and producers is incredibly premature, I think. I think we should be waiting to actually see what happens in the future. And again, I get it. Suddenly people are saying, and sharing very sort of simplistic views of what this is going to do. All sorts of promises are made. And, someone who is in the acting fraternity, for instance, thinks, well, this is great, I'm going to get maternity leave or I'm going to get paid leave. But I think the reality is that that's not going to happen, because people are not working, in lengthy periods. They're working for short periods, and the benefits that are being promised are not there. But what I think they're not realizing is that there are actually a lot of detracting factors. A lot of the things that they're actually currently enjoying, like a good tax dispensation for freelancers, which are suddenly going to disappear. But I think the greatest threat, it's not really about what you're going to win or what you're going to lose. The greatest threat to the industry is it's going to create an incredibly negative perception, both at home and abroad. And people are just going to say, you know what, South Africa is just becoming too difficult to shoot in, certainly from the international investor perspective or international client perspective. And I think even our own people here at home, and I've heard this from advertising agencies, are going to start looking further afield. So I think South Africa actually risks what America had, runaway production. When their costs became too high, they started looking to locations like South Africa to go and produce their content. We could see our own runaway production if legislation becomes too prohibitive. So, if there's one message that I'd like to put to government is speak to the producers, because as much as I believe that everyone in this industry is incredibly important and deserves a say, the reality is that producers are the generators and the originators of the work. And, I think you can listen to different interest groups and you can hear them out, but government has got to come to producers to ask them these questions, because essentially if you start changing things and if you start changing our environment, you create a situation where producers cannot thrive, and that means the beginning of the end for the film industry.
Yeah, and that's definitely a situation we'd like to
that we don't want, exactly.
Yeah.
That's the thing. I think what we all want is we all want to be working, and everybody, we come from different places just in this panel, but I think we all want exactly the same thing. And, I'm a very firm believer in a balance in the industry. We need the different sectors, whether it be commercials or animation or long form, and we need Cape Town and we need Joburg and we need local work and we need service work. So I don't think, anything needs to suffer. What we need to do is we need to grow the size of the pie, rather than all thinking that we've got to hang on to our little tiny slice. We've got to grow the pie.
100%. I think what I'm taking from that is that whatever the solution is in the end, there needs to be an understanding that there isn't a one size fits all. When you look at the different people represented, there's different niches that need to be understood, and the solution needs to be applied within that context. Phumla, I want to bring you in here, and I'm sure you have a lot of notes to share with us as our legal expert on the panel. And I think your career is interesting because you come from the other side where you were talent and you understand that aspect, and then you went and studied law and now you're representing the talent, right? So from your perspective, you know, what do you take from all of this? Specifically touching on points raised like by Simpiwe talking about the fact that, you know, there is that element of free use from a documentary perspective, that they would like to have access to that. What is the legal implication of that? We've heard a lot from Bobby from the we've heard a lot from Bobby in terms of the employment aspects and the implications of that, and also from our other panelists. I mean, also from Nick, just where animation sits and some of the unique aspects in that legally. If you could just wrap up for us and let us know, you know, from your perspective, how are you processing everything?
Thanks, Ntsiki. What an exciting discussion. And I just want to start off by saying that I endorse what Katio was saying, in that this is a brilliant opportunity to start having these discussions. And for me, what's exciting is that they are, you know, previously, like you say, my previous background is that I was talent. And talent is often not interested in what legislation has to do or say. Talent is interested in creating content and then performing that content. And so what was interesting for me, being part of talent, is to realize how important it was to get your understanding of what a legislative environment looked like for the industry. And I think in all the discussions from the first panel into this one, the big buzzword has been an enabling environment, an enabling legislative environment. And most people wouldn't understand what that means. What does an enabling environment mean for this industry, which is so diverse with so many different sectors? We've got animation, we've got, it's very, very diverse. And I think what government may have missed is an important point to go into the different sectors and do a proper impact assessment to understand how each sector is impacted by the laws that they are legislating. And I think the opportunity now is not to then fast track the legislation and pass it into law, is to stop. You know, COVID forced us to stop. So use this opportunity of this, drastic global stop to say, okay, we have a elephant in the room, which is the Copyright Amendment Bill. It's not going away, and more voices are coming to the forefront, and more people are becoming aware what this legislation looks like and what impact it has, the negative or the impact that I don't think, obviously the unintended negative impact that it will have. When Bobby speaks of freedom, as the industry by nature is a free-natured industry, but when you take away certain freedoms like freedom to contract, government needs to understand what it does for an international investor or a producer locally who's trying to purchase rights, like Nick was saying, and I think for me, what I would then add to that is that there is such a need for information dissemination to the industry. From a government point of view, and also from the different organizations that do represent the different sectors. For me, what I find often is that a lot of the buzzwords that are going around and being spoken about are coming from an uninformed position. But when people begin to understand the impact of all these laws and legislation and how they will impact their sectors, then they sit back and they stop, and the narrative changes. We had several discussions where producers and performers, even performers who were thinking this is great for them, sit back and realize this may not be the greatest, rainbow solution for us. And I think the most important thing for us to then look into is, can we afford a disinvestment into this industry, into the country, at a time when we are moving into a digital, fast-paced era where we're part of a global space. We can't operate as South Africa in a very, cornered environment. We have to look at how the world is viewing South Africa from an attractive location point of view, but are we a high-risk location? And if we are, we have to engage and say what will then work best to attract that investment while encouraging economic growth for the industry. And then just going to what Sipi was saying, and I think the problem is that a lot of misinformation has been disseminated around what the bills will, provide. In other words, it's kind of like a lucky packet. We've got these bills and you open them up and there's all these great things that are being promised. But for example, we're not going to be able to access the archives of BBC by having fair use. It's not. It doesn't allow that. So things that need to be looked in is like I'm saying, the impact should go into the documentary filmmakers. Maybe specific exceptions can be legislated that are that meet their needs. But from a position when we talk about, is there an opportunity? There's absolutely an opportunity to start engaging vigorously in province. I'm excited with what's going to happen. Hopefully, like Katia was saying, it has to be fixed. The legislation has to go back to the drawing board. We have to engage, society, creatives. We have to have a proper impact assessment done, and then we can get it right.
Yeah, thank you so much for those contributions. And before we wrap up our panel discussion, I do also want to get a final word from everybody, just to know, action, step, process. What is your one thing that you're like, okay, for this to work, for the industry to grow, for the industry to be successful, to be sustainable, this is what we need to happen. And I'm going to start with Simpiwe, who's joining us virtually. Simpiwe, what's your one thing that needs to happen going forward?
I think for the Documentary Filmmakers Association is really fixing the public broadcaster. I mean, in many countries around the world, that is where mostly documentary filmmakers, find a platform to express themselves. And currently at the moment, in South Africa, it is quite difficult, to do that. So, we need to actually lower that, barrier to entry, because, documentary filmmakers end up staying in the YouTube space, and so they just produce content to be freely used and never be able to make revenue out of it. So we need to actually, to be able to actually have access to the public platform and be able to actually have a sizable slot there to be able to, to showcase our craft. And also in the process as well, encourage, things like citizen journalism that actually, because of documentaries by their nature, ordinary citizens are able to actually, create their own stories that can actually be able to sit, on these platforms. Yes, we are excited about the likes of Netflix and that are there. But there's very little access, for emerging filmmakers to be able to access such platforms unless you are really established.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I'm coming to studio. I'm going to start that side with you, Katia. What is your one thing that needs to happen?
I think we need to make our legislative environment accessible so that we can do the work that we want to do. We can work internationally with co-producers. We can bring resources into the country. We can find the DTI can bring make the environment conducive for people to access the rebate. It's about making things work rather than making things clog up, and some of the legislation has really been creating log jams, and so we need to persuade people that actually the opposite is possible. Yeah. If we are able to see ourselves as a global player, and if we look at places like Brazil, there was a huge growth, America, huge growth, there's huge growth in the industry, and that is providing jobs. That is creating an economic basis for growing. It's not just going to be gold. We are going to be the new gold as the creative sector. So we need to persuade government and make them understand that that is possible, that we can really be positive.
So less hurdles from them and more facilitation for growth and success. Pumla, your final?
We have to get our copyrights to be corrected. We should stop beating around the bush around that. It's important to get this environment to attract investment. We have to engage society, creatives in industry around what it means for them. We also have to remember what the principle of copyright is, and we cannot overextend copyright to users at the detriment of producers or copyright owners. We have to ensure that government understands the needs of the industry specifically for each sector and how it affects each sector, how it affects animation, how it affects and do a proper analysis on what those legislative provisions that are being imposed will have, so that we continue to grow this industry, to be be the next Hollywood and take the content globally and attract more investment into the industry. So I think for me, it's the buzzword is and legislative environment has to be fixed. And we actually need to stop having dialogues around whether it's wrong. It is incorrect currently. There's no clarity. It's ambiguous. It's creating a discomfort for any investor. It's what it's done. It's actually done a holdback for a couple of years. You know, if you look at the entertainment industry, people plan for about 3 years around production and investment. So already we're sitting at a position where we are likely to not see vigorous investment for the next 3 years. So we have to get it right so we can invite that investment back into the country.
I love that honesty, that it's not about whether it's right or wrong. It's not working. Let's stop and we need to fix it. Nick, your final thought on the one thing that needs to happen?
Yeah, we need certainty and predictability on our incentives. That's for damn sure. What I think we also need to think about is identifying and enhancing our value proposition, whatever that may be. So, and we have to keep working on that. So, in the sense that we're culturally aligned to some of the most developed film and television industries abroad, good time zones, so when they're sleeping, we're awake, and when we're working, when they're sleeping, we're and so on and so forth, and vice versa. We have to, the rate of exchange, we have to leverage all of these advantages to our favor.
Yeah. And we're in a good position to do that.
I think we are, yeah. And like everyone's saying, just to echo the same sentiments, is that we need a good policy framework and regulatory environment, because without which we're not going to be as competitive, and there's going to be reasons for people to look elsewhere. So anything that deters or disincentivizes investment or service coming away from South Africa, this is something we have to address.
Yeah. Thandi, your one thing?
My one thing is we have to get back to work, and seriously back to work. And one of the big things that is preventing us from doing so is insurance and COVID insurance. So government needs to come to the party and discuss with the sector how we can get back to work and get productions up and running, and being able to have people covered on set, so sets don't come to a standstill because someone is ill. Productions don't fall apart because of that. So it's about getting back to work, and it's about working with our sector to make sure, from an insurance perspective and from a coverage of the pandemic, we are back at work and they come to the party to assist producers with doing just that.
Fantastic. And then quickly, Bobby, your one thing.
There's nothing quick about me. I think the biggest thing is that a vacuum has been created in this industry where producers are not being heard. What's happening is everybody else is coming, every advocacy group, every interest group is coming in, and they're having the dialogue with government. And because we are too busy doing what we do and fixing 1,000 problems every day to keep the wheels turning, we are being ignored. And I think what we really need to do is, you know, we have differences in our approach and the way that we do things, but I think producers really need to come together across the spectrum, basically, and start talking more to each other, and start informing the conversations that government are having about our industry. Because if we don't do that, someone else is going to do that, and that's going to lead to a catastrophe. So I say my one bit thing that I want to do is to see producers taking the power back.
Fantastic. And here you are representing all the producers. So hopefully this conversation continues beyond this particular panel discussion. Thank you very much to Simpiwe for joining us virtually. And thank you so much to all of my panelists for joining us in studio and sharing your thoughts and insights and just contributing to this conversation. I definitely know we can say a lot more. And unfortunately, time isn't on our side, but I really do appreciate your contribution. We are going to take a brief break and get our panelists for the third discussion. And looking at that conversation, we're really going to hear from people who've gone global and who, when we were talking about the film industry and when we were talking about making it successful and sustainable, we're going to hear stories of productions that have gone out there and that are making an impact. So we'll be back in studio shortly.
Thank you, guys. All the best.
sense.
Because these guys are not different. They're not filmmakers. They're producers. So
So I'm going to ask Pippa to share on that. What is that thing that? What is that tipping point that takes something from locals to global?
let us speak on whatever else.
Oh, and then Vanessa. Did Vanessa get added in? Oh, she's from
Triggerfish. So she will speak to. I think she had a question. Let's have a look.
So Peter is just turned on to
Vanessa. There we go. In addition to the interest with this. So maybe you can reserve
thank you very much.
to say you spoke about all this promise.
Yes, I know.
Now, what about skills? Maybe just say something in your field. She'll jump to that.
That's fine. And then just the visuals for set. This feels good to me because everyone's down there.
Okay.
Should we accommodate? I mean, I don't mind sitting here, but then is this?
Yeah, that's fine.
Is that okay?
Yeah.
That won't be a.
That's fine. That's perfect.
Okay, cool. Bradley, Pippa, Quentin, Vanessa, can you guys hear me? Okay, cool.
There's no one coming here.
Hi,
Yeah.
Bradley, Pippa, Quentin, Vanessa. You're all joining us virtually. I just want to check if you're able to hear me.
Relax.
Bradley, are you with us? Can you hear me? Okay. Pippa, are you able to hear me? No, there's 4 people. Okay, hey Pippa, thank you so much. I can hear you as well. Quentin, are you able to hear me? Vanessa, are you able to hear me? I can. Okay, cool. So I've got a thumbs up from Pippa and Vanessa. Bradley and Quentin, are you guys with us? let the conversation flow from your experiences and what has worked for you guys and what. Please just feel free to jump in. What I will do is start with Quinton and Vanessa, who are joining us virtually. So Quinton and Vanessa, I'm hoping you can still hear me. So I'm going to start the conversation with you guys, and then Quinton, I'm wanting to find out from you alternative or new business models that we're seeing.
Hi, welcome back. We're continuing our conversation looking at the South African film production industry, and we're going into our final panel discussion for the evening. And we're looking at South African producers going global and taking our stories internationally. And I think when we've been speaking about the regulatory environment, when we're talking about the economic impact and really understanding productions, there's not just one thing that exists for entertainment, but a number of different touch points that exist around it. For me, this final panel discussion is the image of that. And what are we talking about when we're looking at the faces and the people that we're coming together to support? And I'm really excited to hear the insights from this particular panel. So joining me in studio, I have Isaac Mokajane, who's the executive producer at Diprente Films. And then also joining us in studio is Azania Mwendane. And then also in studio, we have Katlego Ramaphakela. And then joining us virtually, we do have apologies from Bradley Joshua and Pippa Algeric. Because of time constraints, they weren't able to join us because they were tuning in from different regions. But we do have virtually Quinton Fredericks, who's the producer at Spear Films, and Vanessa Ann Sinden, who's the producer at Triggerfish Animation. Starting with you, Quinton, we had some conversation coming in from our previous panels talking about how do we create a sustainable environment, and also understanding the fact that we can't have a one solution fits everybody, right? So from your perspective, I want to know what are some of the new or alternative business models that you're seeing coming through, and how do we apply those within a South African context?
Okay, so I can probably speak to our experience as Spear Films in terms of the production that we finished last year called The Professionals, which was a co-production between and which was partly financed by the IDC in terms of their loan financing facility, and then the DTI rebate, which accounted for approximately 49% of the total production budget. And this is essentially a model that has always existed, but I don't think has been fully exploited in the South African context in terms of all the co-production treaties that we have. And just to say that the big thing for us, obviously, in South Africa and bringing innovative content to the international market is the question of the quality of the product and the investment in writing and script development, which I think is something that Eddie Mbalo alluded to many years ago when he was CEO of the NFVF, and that we as an industry have been lobbying and agitating for, is that if we want to produce quality product that is commercially viable and that has universal appeal to the international market, then we need greater investment in our writing talent. We also need mentorship, we need nurturing, and we need feedback from established international writers to come on board and give insight and support and advice. And that's something that we at Spirit Films are driving in terms of a mentorship program with up-and-coming young writing and producing talent. We've got a business plan that Deloitte & Touche has developed for us, and it's based on many years of experience that we've had in terms of these challenges. So with regard to professionals, for example, is on a production budget of approximately $27 million, we ended up with 165 million being spent in South Africa. And probably for the first time, and I speak under correction here because there may be instances, but that I'm not aware of, is that we actually had Black creative talent directing 5 of those international episodes out of a 10-part series. And those 2 directors were Tabang Molewa and Oliver Schmidt. And in addition to that, we had the question of the procurement target with regards to the DTI rebate. So this was an Irish-South African co-production, but also partnered with an American showrunner, Michael Colleary, who did Face Off and Tomb Raider. And the process of developing that script was a collaborative process. So we had international writers, and it took about 3 years for us to actually bring the product to market from inception. And then we executed the bulk of that production was actually shot. I think we did 4 episodes in Ireland and we did 6 in South Africa. And the idea essentially was that we would be able to create extensive opportunity for local creative talent, i.e. specifically Black up-and-coming talent. And that at the same time, we would give a boost to Black-owned businesses in respect of the DTI rebate scheme, which had set a minimum target of 20% procurement from Black-owned suppliers. We actually exceeded that target by an additional 17%. So we ended up spending something like 57 million rand on Black-owned suppliers in respect of the DTI procurement policy as regards the amendment to the rebate scheme. Now, that model is obviously premised on the fact that the DTI rebate scheme is central to giving foreign investors the peace of mind and the security to invest in a project of this size and magnitude. And only with that in place will we be able to execute that production and also engage with the process of including Black creative talent in the execution of the production, which obviously adds kudos to their credentials in the international marketplace. That coupled with the willingness of the IDC Film and Television Unit to actually come on board and put their money where their mouths are, was ultimately what gave this production the impetus it needed to be executed in South Africa. I don't think we would have been able to execute that. And so I think that it's a model that we can easily replicate in South Africa using the co-production treaties, which I don't think are being exploited extensively enough, simply because young up-and-coming directing and producing talent often struggle with the resources to be able to network and to travel to these different territories and to engage with their counterparts in those co-production countries. And that's a challenge. And I think there was an attempt by ATFT a few years ago to actually facilitate that product and that process by taking Black talent to these international markets, including Cannes. But the challenge, of course, is that a lot of these people went to those markets without actual product to sell. And that's actually what we need. So in the South African context with professionals, we had writers like Roland Dixon, who had 30 years of experience. And that's really the kind of talent that you need and experience if you want to execute a project on this size and scale. And that's where the gap falls short in the South African context, because we don't have enough investment in our writing talent and we don't give it enough credibility. So as co-chair of the which for the first time in its history has now got a majority Black exco, 50% of whom are Black female producers, directors, and creatives. We are embarking on a program of looking at how we actually drive the development of that in partnership with institutions like the South African Film Academy, the National Arts Council, Department of Arts and Culture, National Film and Video Foundation. And what it actually requires is a collaborative effort by all of these agencies who have a common goal, which is actually to drive the strategic development of the creative industries and film in particular, as far as we are concerned, because the DTI identified the creative sector as a key growth area a couple of years ago at the policy level. Unfortunately, policy and practice is often lagging far behind the other.
Yeah.
So we have these
Sorry, Quentin, we seem to be losing you there a little bit, but you've shared quite a...
of adequacies. And I think that if we were able to develop a coherent strategy where all of these agencies could... Sorry?
Sorry, we lost you there for a little bit, and I think now we just have a lag. But what I hear you saying, Quentin, is really the looking at co-creation. Sorry, Quentin, I'm just going to ask for our tech guy to put you on mute for a second, because I think we have a delay with your audio coming through. And I see Bradley has been able to join us as well. Welcome, Bradley. Can I just do a sound check and hear if you're able to hear me, Bradley? Hi, Bradley. Okay, so I think we're struggling with Bradley's connection as well. So I do want to move on to Vanessa. Vanessa, we heard a lot from Quentin talking about co-creation and having product to sell when we get to the international market.
Sorry, I was slightly late.
Okay, so I think we've lost our Zoom feed, which is fine. Our tech team will sort that out. I wanted to talk to our guests in studio, and I really want to find out from you guys is, let's start with you, Azania, is what should we be doing to promote South Africa, but also just the continent as a whole as a destination for filmmakers?
You know, going back to the panel before where, you know, everyone, between Bobby and Ketty, where they were just advocating that from a location perspective, there's nowhere really in South Africa in particular. We have so many different countries within one country, within a 2-hour flight. I mean, you move between, you know, a delta, you know, through to snow, through to, depending on, you know, the kind of climate you need. So in terms of promoting, it really is taking the authenticity of who we are as people, who we are as locations, and taking that to the world, right? And promoting South Africa and the continent as filming destinations of choice and co-producing nations of choice. I mean, at the moment, yes, South Africa doesn't have a co-producing treaty with any other country on the continent, which is a really big boo-boo, as far as I think most of us are concerned on this panel. But is to then take those co-producing treaties that we have about 9, maybe 10, 11 now across the world, and activating them to actually have more participation on the ground. The kind of things that are happening right now, and we do have film authorities, we do have the legislation, although not all of it is perfect. We do have incentives on the ground. We do have various countries, at least about 5 countries that have film commissions that have built enabling environments for filmmakers to thrive, local filmmakers and inbound filmmakers when it comes to servicing and such. But really it is about mitigating elements of risk, promoting the fact that The continent is a safe space to be. The continent is not a dark space to be. The continent is a very cosmopolitan environment. The continent, once, especially from the US, the moment you leave the East Coast, you already start maximizing on a 30% reduction of costs, right? From a point of living expenses, eating expenses, travel expenses, all of those elements that generate in other countries, they're quite expensive. So it's taking the goodness of our continent, the accessibility within the space. It's very accessible to work in Kenya. It's extremely accessible to work in South Africa. It is accessible to work in Namibia. It's just to take away the negativity that we are starting to own as African people and start to take on board the positivities that we have as African people. Other things that we should start doing is taking, especially when it comes to local productions and promoting that films are made within certain countries, is saying to from a legislative point of view and funding point of view is, okay, of the content of the country, what are the top 100 locations, all right? And how do you then ensure that within the film, at least 3 of those top locations are used, right? With their name, to say Nelson Mandela Bridge, Johannesburg, because then that starts to localize and starts to help people recognize that that particular bridge, if it's seen 3, 4, 5, 6 times, that bridge psychologically is in South Africa, right? What does that do? It then speaks to tourism, it starts speaking to other elements, it starts speaking to the multiplier effects for our country. Same thing, you know, when people always look to Africa, they just think it's just wildlife. And yes, it is to a certain degree, but then you've got a lot of cityscapes, you've got a lot of homes, you've got high-end environments that are seen in different spaces. So it's about taking those elements and promoting that. We do participate a lot across the world. Yes, you know, pre-COVID, there was a lot of things that we were doing. We were going to Order Right festivals, we were going to Order Right meetings. Yeah. We were, you know, the DTI was helping us with outbound trips. We were having the right conversations, we were in the right spaces, but it's just how do we then not become small in that space and thinking that we're from a developing, in inverted commas, environment, because we're not from a developing space. I think our mindset and our competitive edge is far more is far increasing in that. Just to kind of round it up as well, is that not to be scared of yourself, your authenticity of your script, right? I was lamenting to the gents earlier on that, for instance, Star Trek, right? There is a South African girl who's on Star Trek Discovery right now, right? And listening to the accent, you start to realize that our accents are accepted. So if you're going to actually perform, you don't have to try and have a British accent anymore. You don't have to have an American accent. The authenticity of who we are, where our locations are, maximizing our incentives and promoting the incentives and using them to promote the accessibility in our country. Those are things that we really must start pushing forward. So it's really about remaining authentic in who we are and not being scared. Just lastly on that, when we started going to Cannes over 15 years ago, we were one of the first of 12 countries that had our national pavilion. Now there's hundreds of countries. But what does that say? It means that the international world are beyond accepting of who we are. They're just saying shine. So that's essentially what we're trying to do, is shine.
That's what we need to do. We need to go out there and shine.
Yeah.
Isaac, you're with Duprente, and Katlego, you're with Burnt Onion, and you both work on productions that have gone out there and told our story. And I want to find out from your perspective, you know, Quentin was talking a lot about having a product to sell. What does it take to produce that kind of quality product that does compete on a global scale, and that people go, yeah, this is something that we can have at the various festivals? I'll have you speak first, Isaac.
Cool. I mean, I think, you know, we live in an interesting time. I'm going to talk from an original content perspective, as opposed to more of the servicing side, which I think we've heard a lot of, which is traditionally, I think, been the backbone of what the South African industry has been on an international level. But I think there's been a major disruptor in the last 4 or 5 years, which has been the streaming platforms coming in. And that's done 2 things. First, it's seen a hell of a lot of new content flooding the market, which has meant that people have started to consume more content than ever before, which has had the result of them getting to a point where creating content that sticks out and that feels different has become premium. People have seen the same thing over and over again and now looking for something different. The second thing is, for a long time, I know for ourselves as a company, and as I'm sure a lot of other South African producers, we've always believed that our content has a global audience. And I think what has always been the middleman for us has always been distributors and broadcasters saying no before showing it to the audience. It's always been this kind of barrier. And so, all those trips to Cannes where we were there with our first feature film and our TV shows that we produced over the years, before even knowing whether the global audience would consume it or not, the broadcaster would stop it from going through. So I think for us, our breakthrough was when we produced Catching Feelings, and Netflix picked that up and put it on their audience, for the global audience for the first time. And I think everybody was surprised by how well it performed in the world. It's a very Joburg story. It deals with our politics and our kind of racial dynamics, and it's as Joburg as it gets, well, from a certain perspective. And I think everybody expected it to do well here on the continent, and particularly in South Africa on Netflix. But I think a month in, they called us and, they were kind of raving about how well it did everywhere. And for us, it kind of validated this thing that we were kind of chasing blindly, that our stories are stories that can be consumed everywhere in the world, and for a lot of the reasons that Azania was talking about would be successful. And I think, when they came back later on and we produced Queen Sono and Blood and Water came out, we saw the same trend again. These shows are doing very well everywhere in the world, not just on the continent. And so it's giving us data points that we can point to as producers, saying, look, if you tell an authentic story that's true to where it's from, and it's not watered down, and it's not an Americanized version, or we don't have to fly in an American actor to play like the lead role, this is 100% local, that there is a market for it, and that market is booming. So we find ourselves, I think, at an interesting time where the more local your story is, the more true it is to where it comes from, the higher the chance of it working globally. And this is not a thing specific to Africa or South Africa. This is everywhere. I think, for a long time it's been American content and UK content. And I think now you're starting to find people are consuming stuff out of Russia, out of, Malaysia, out of India. And it's an exciting time to be a global producer. And the lesson that everybody's kind of learning right now is just be true, find that real voice and put that on these platforms. And so far it's been working. People are enjoying it. So that's kind of my perspective.
Authenticity is a really good seller because that's the value that people want. I can get Americanisms anyway. I want a South African perspective. I want an African perspective. And I'm curious, I'm going to ask you what you think about, what he just said now. But on that point, do you think South African or African stories must be told by South Africans or Africans?
I mean, I think it boils down to what I'm saying about it being authentic. Yeah. I don't think it has to be told necessarily by Africans, but it has to be someone who understands the story that they're telling. And then most of the time that will be someone who lived it, which is in turn an African. So it's kind of like, it works the other way around. I think there's this term now that I've been hearing, it's called glocal, which is local for global. Yeah. So the more authentic your thing is and when we're talking about this, again, it's not just about saying your story must be South African. It's talking about the specificity of where you're from, the township you're from, or the city you're from, or the suburb, or the subculture that you grew up in, or that you understand that's specific to you. The more you hone down into those types of things that make your story feel like it's a new lens, then the more the world is interested in it. And so it's not so much for me about, trying to put a label on who can tell the story, as more of saying who understands the story, who has lived the story, who has walked these shoes. And so when they put that on screen, it's a real representation of it, and it isn't like which we've seen a lot. I think we've seen a lot of foreigners coming into places and telling their perspective of what they think the people living there feel and feel like. And, I think the world has kind of moved past that. And now it's like there's, just to kind of ground this in what we've been talking about today, I think as the demand for the stuff grows, it's important that the environment is right for us to be able to tell these stories, because it's a lot of work and it's a lot of sweat and tears going out there and pitching and trying to get people to get to see what you're trying to do, just to get the money and the people around you to make this thing. And so if you do all of that and then you come back and there's things that are holding you back locally because of legislative stuff or policy stuff or just implementation of rebates and that kind of thing, it's heartbreaking, So the opportunity's there. The producers are out there that are chasing it, and as long as we can come back home once we've killed whatever, caught the hunt and bring it back home, as long as there's a fire there so that we can start cooking,
we're good to go.
We're good to go.
Cool. Katlego, what is your perspective on what does it take to produce that global consumption quality product?
I mean, I think my experiences was probably going to be the same and like echo what Azania and Isaac have said in terms of like telling the authentic stories. You know, I take our experience as Burnt Onion Productions. We'd been also producing television shows for years and years and years. And obviously as producers and creators, the one thing that you do want is to tell a global story, to have your stories reach a global audience. So, you know, in our most recent experience with our feature film, Seriously Single, which probably was kind of a similar trajectory to what Isaac is saying, our story was intended for South Africa. You know, it was, you know, Joburg based. It was about 2 South African women, and it was authentically and uniquely we were telling it for a South African audience. It was meant to actually be for cinematic release, and in a sense, we've got a good opportunity by COVID coming into the fore, which led us to Netflix. They obviously loved the film and picked it up, and same situation. And that wasn't, you know, at the beginning of the year, that really wasn't the trajectory we had envisioned. But the fact that Netflix has come into the country and is the global audience is now at our doorstep and easily accessible, made it a success on their platform, which is something that we didn't expect. You want that to happen, obviously. And it surpassed their expectations as well. And that just goes to show that, you know, like I said, I'm going to echo what has been said. It just goes to show that if you're authentic in the storytelling and the stories that you want to tell and the stories that you know how to tell, I think, and if it's universal stories as well, like the lived experience that we'd have here in a metropolitan city might be the same to another country, so they're going to relate.
The context changes, but the lived experience
doesn't. And just that there's universal themes that you can tell in certain stories. Obviously, we're still trying to navigate it. I'm not going to say I know how to, like we've cracked the code and, you know, we can be international with every story we tell, but I think just that authenticity, and it's something that we want to see now with the new Netflix original that we're working on, How to Ruin Christmas, The Wedding, and we'll get to see if that really does, you know, keep translating, as we go along.
Cool. So, I mean, our previous panel made a point around the fact that, you know, when we're looking at solutions for producers, it's understanding that each niche is different, you know, so long format documentaries are different to short format, short films are different to longer films. Yes, there's similarities, but there are certain specificities within that happen differently. I think from a talent perspective and, you know, how we're telling stories, I want to ask that question from that perspective and ask how important is it as we grow and as we expand the industry, but also produce and sell more of our stories abroad, that we're not making Africans one homogeneous group, you know, so understanding that, you know, when you're writing the script, when you're telling the story in a metropolitan big city that could be the same as anywhere else in the world, it's not the same kinds of Africans.
It's not the same. I mean, we are a massive, and I like to call it a massive nation, right? Because yes, we're all Africans, but we have different needs, we have different, you know, dialects, we have different experiences, we have different understanding and different viewpoints and perspectives, right? So, I mean, you'd have a situation whereby a Rwandan story and Rwandan lived experience is very different from a Cameroonian lived experience, very different from a Senegalese, very different from a Tunisian, and, you know, Egypt. So to lump us all into, oh, there's the Africans over there, they're just doing their thing, it is very dangerous, but it's also very dangerous for us to assume that of our neighbors in Botswana. So it's having to recognize that and to take that in, and that's what becomes part of the promotional aspect of it as well, is to differentiate yourself and say you are from this part of the continent. I mean, for instance, there's a massive drive now to make sure that our languages are seen on TV, right? In the authentic way that they are. Yes, there are subtitles, but we watch Korean shows all the time, and we're loving them, and you know, and that's okay. Why can't we do the same thing with Swahili? You know, why can't we do the same thing with isiZulu? Why can't we do the same thing with Arabic from the continent? So it's that authenticity and recognizing that we are very different. And as much as Swaziland is very close to South Africa, the Swazi lived experience is very, very different from the South African lived experience. And tell that story and be authentic to that space.
Yeah, 100%. And I did want to highlight that because I think that's a very important thing to have come across in this conversation, but also to our audiences coming through. I believe our panelists that are joining us via Zoom are back in. And I want to go back to Vanessa. And Vanessa, we're going to touch on the point, you know, talking about skills development. We heard from the earlier panelists that we need the regulatory environment to be able to support a sustainable film and production industry. But I want to find out, in terms of the skills that are coming through, how do we grow the kind of skills that can produce the products that we want, but they can also sustain the kind of industry that we're trying to grow?
It's a tough question just to answer in one little paragraph. I represent the part of the animation space from Cape Town and Triggerfish Animation Studios, and you know, navigating this space is so complex because not only are you trying to just keep the lights on with a business, you're also very heavily invested in, you know, learnerships, scholarships, opportunities, funding gaps, making sure that your stories are extremely authentic, that there are diverse voices and artists involved with that producing of the product. So there's so many areas you have to navigate through and try and plug at different areas. And I think one of the big things I've seen in the last sort of 4 or 5 years in animation is to make sure that our writers are the best writers for the space, for the story, and that you can then take that story, find the broadcaster, find the investor who's going to help bring that to the screen and try and connect the dots, build a bridge to try and make sure that that story gets told, and surround that team of writers with the best chances for this to get made. And it's tough to see. I work at the moment on a Netflix original called Mama K's Team 4, and it's the first animated African original picked up. And quite amazingly, it's an all-female writers' room, all women of color who are from the continent, and they're writing a series that's set in Lusaka in Zambia. And it was something so important for us to make sure that these women who've previously written in live action could transition into animation and not only work in this space and work with big LA head writers and be groomed in the animation space, that they could then plant seeds for their own series after this, and to be able to be brought into writers' rooms in animation after this project as well. And that journey has been a 2-year journey just with the writing team. And so I really believe strongly in focusing on an area. And at the moment, as Triggerfish, we're focused heavily on the talent who want to tell a story, shaping that writer into writing the best story that's going to go global, and then putting a pre-production team around that story to make sure that we're not only pitching and getting investment from the Netflixes, the HBO Max, the Disney Plus investment, but then also being able to do the pre-production on the continent and make sure that the post-production stays here. And I think those are the areas we're focused on at the moment. And there's only so much skills dev we can do on any given project. And those are really the areas we're focused on at the moment, and really making sure there's a team where we've got international consultants, we've got an international head writer, we've got an art director who's based in Europe but who's working with local artists to make sure the pre-production is production ready. So those are the ways we've been doing skills dev and trying to bridge the gap since about 2015, and our very first story lab, which then became a writers lab. And we're actually in the middle of doing an African anthology now, which is almost like a directors lab, and essentially focus on directors, helping them pitch their stories, get that funding, and let's make some great African stories. So it's been a 5-year journey, but we're trying to compartmentalize so that we can make sure that those people who get an opportunity actually can execute, and that can get produced, and it can be excellent, and it can be received worldwide with applause. So that's really, it's a slow journey, but that's really how we've been doing it.
It's a slow journey, but we definitely are getting there. Thank you so much for that, Vanessa. I do want to bring in Bradley Joshua. I know you were a bit late in joining us because of the time difference, but Bradley is the CEO at Gambit Films. And Bradley, I want to find out from you. You know, we've heard a lot from various panelists around, you know, the opportunities that exist, the challenges that exist, but we know that, you know, South Africa does have the skills, we do have the talent, and we definitely can. I want to know from you, what does it take to secure the kinds of productions that we are wanting to sell on a global scale to have those happen in South Africa?
Thank you for the question. Yeah, for us, and it's been our experience that you know, you keep going. You know, you develop stuff that you believe in, and you keep going. And those things that you develop sometimes changes depending on who you speak to, and so you modify them, but you keep going. I mean, if I can just relay our experience, for example, with Netflix, you know, for many years we were trying to pitch to them, and eventually, you know, probably after 3 years of trying, you know, we had the opportunity to come in front of them and pitch to them. So, you know, for me, it's keep going, and then take what you have in front of you and make it the best that it can be. You know, and that's been our experience. We've taken everything since our inception some 10 years ago, when we started with little commercials. We took that and we made the best of it, and we made sure that we tried to be the best at doing that. And as our scope grew and as more things came our way, we took those things and made the best of it. You know, we took every opportunity to secure the next opportunity. And so I think when you keep doing that, you know, players like the Netflix and other streamers and other studios, you know, it's been our experience that they do notice. If you think of our film that we did in 2017, Nommer 37, was a very local story, told in a very local dialect with subtitles, brown people, and a lot of people, international sales agents, told us that you know, it has to be in English in order for it to make a mark on the globe. It has to be like this, it has to be like that. And we decided to stay true to the story, you know, and where it came from. And at the end of the day, you know, we received North American distribution for that film. We received European distribution for that film. We even had theatrical release in Los Angeles and New York with that film. So you know, and if I think back, Quentin was at one stage part of the team of on that film, and Quentin can testify to like where it began. You know, the things that we did, the sacrifices that we made. I still never paid myself for that film. You know, everything went into the production value of that film. And yes, when you look at it, you see that it's not perfect. But I think we gave everything, and the results showed. And because of that film, in actual fact, and aside from all of the soliciting that I tried to do with Netflix, because of that film, Netflix reached out to us. You know, they had seen the film, they liked what they saw. Would we be interested in pitching TV ideas to them? So, you know, that for me is the testimony to you take what you have, you do the best, you give it your all, and you keep showing up. That's been our experience.
Yeah, and I think South Africans are really good at taking what we have and making the best of it. I want to bring Pippa in. Pippa, who's a filmmaker, Pippa Ulrich, and you recently co-directed the My Octopus Teacher, which Craig Foster, who's a filmmaker, said that may well walk away with an Oscar for Best Documentary Feature in 2021. So I think that's fantastic. And Pippa, I want to hear from you. You know, what has been your experience in producing My Octopus Teacher, and how it's also been received in the market?
Well, I mean, we've been pretty blown away by how it's been received in the market. It was this little tiny documentary that we started off making in Craig Foster's attic. We had no budget. We had no real distribution plan. It was really just me and him sitting with an archive of footage and putting together the story of this experience that he'd had. And we struggled for a long time. We took like 2 years to get to a rough cut that we could actually show to Netflix. And then we were just really lucky that we got it to the right person at the right time. And I think, yeah, the reaction we've received has completely blown us away. I mean, the organization that I work for, we're not a production company. We partnered with Off the Fence, which is a kind of production company / distributor in Amsterdam, specializing only in natural history. But we're more of a conservation organization made up of a whole lot of filmmakers and storytellers and journalists. And something in this film just spoke to people. And I think it's exactly what you guys were talking about earlier, about having an authentic story and having a universal story. And there's a lot to be said for a platform like Netflix. At the beginning, we were kind of worried about, obviously film festivals all got cancelled because of COVID. So we were concerned that we weren't going to have an audience, but we released the film. It launched on the platform on a Monday night. And when we woke up on the Tuesday morning, we were receiving an email every 3 seconds.
That's incredible.
So, yeah, we've had comments from Jane Goodall and George Monbiot and Zach Braff, Diana Ross. It's been crazy experience to live through. And like I say, it was this little tiny film that we just started making because we were in love with the story and in love with the subject.
Yeah, Kataka was saying earlier, Anya, that there is no formula to what works. You have your story, you have what you want to produce, and you put it out there and almost, hoping that the world will accept it. From your perspective, have you found something that creates that tipping point where you're like, okay, cool, I think this is where the magic is, or did you have a similar experience?
Yeah, I mean, I think when you wake up in the morning and all you can think about is this project, and your whole body is filled with energy and you're so excited to sit down in front of a computer for 14 hours a day, then you've got something that's special. But you never know if other people are going to find it special as well. So it's really exciting when other people come on board. And for me, as a first-time filmmaker, I was incredibly privileged to get introduced to some of the best filmmakers in the world. My co-director, James Reed, is probably one of the top natural history directors in Bristol at the moment. And obviously natural history is a very specific little niche world, and everything runs out of Bristol in England. And it's always kind of, you're competing with the BBC and now Netflix, but that's quite new. So it's quite an insular community. So to break into it and then to also be able to work with people who can teach you things the way that they did. And I also have to say, like, being able to work with Netflix and being mentored by Sarah Edelson. Then she brought in an incredible edit consultant called Jinx Godfrey, who she edited Chernobyl and Man on Wire and The Theory of Everything. So she's a multi-Academy Award-winning, Emmy Award-winning editor. So for someone who'd been making a film in an attic as a first-time filmmaker to now be exposed to these people and guided by them and taught by them, I mean, I couldn't really be more grateful. And that is the power of working with someone like Netflix, I guess. Yeah. They know exactly what you need to bring your production up to reach its potential.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Pippa. I want to wrap up with our panel discussion with really looking at the fact that I think a lot of people assume that big productions fall out the sky, right? It's a big production and made it onto Netflix. Of course, the journey was easy. Of course, the money was there. And that's not the case, right? So just a word from everybody, and I'll start with our panelists joining us virtually, is what's your one thing that you think needs to happen going forward to make sure that those big productions do continue to happen and that there is continued support and continued budget to make sure that we can continue producing products that end up on a global scale consumed by a global audience. Pippa, I already have you on the screen, so I'm going to start with you, and then we can go through to Vanessa after you.
Well, I think from a natural history point of view, we're actually at a huge advantage. as Africans, because we have some of the best wildlife and nature stories on the planet. And for decades and decades and decades, people have been flying in from England and America and other places and filming our animals and our nature. And most of the time, Africans don't even get to see those nature shows. So that's the first thing, is for people to really be aware that there's a huge opportunity in the natural history filmmaking sphere. And if you have a good story, and if you're really, really invested in it, and if you have something that's unique, and have the right context, which is always the biggest thing, I think people are ready to listen to us. And I think there's also a realization that we can't keep having stories about, Africa's environment being told by people who've never lived here.
Fantastic. Thanks, Pippa. Vanessa?
I think to ensure that whatever you're producing is going to be a hit globally, I really believe not only making sure the story is authentic, like we've been discussing all evening, but making sure that your investors, the partners you're partnering with, are going to be plugging in additional monies into that budget to make sure skills development and bringing up the next tier of talent is built into that production budget. With an animation, it's a very privileged space where you spend quite a lot of money studying in the animation space, and there are very few opportunities. But if we can make sure that a part of that budget is signed off, that there's skills development happening at the same time, while in pre-production, while in development, while in production, I think we're going to see people rise up quite quickly. And I think that's a huge success, because we're not only telling an authentic story, we've got talent who are actually telling their story. The stories are super diverse. They're being skilled in their production. And I think we then take everybody to the finish line with something that's a global success. So that would really be something I'd like to flag as something that needs to happen for the animation industry. There's a huge, huge gap. People aren't experienced enough. Even on my current projects, I'm looking to internationals, Europeans, Americans, Canadians, to help play key crew roles, and especially roles where there's such few women in this industry. And I think if we can just acknowledge that it's going to take extra money, as soon as the clock starts ticking, you need to produce and deliver, that pressure is on. But almost if you acknowledge that you're grooming and you're taking a team with you, then they can actually have the chance to do this on the next time round, next episodes, next season, next feature film. So it's really important that we keep that in mind. And I think, sorry, going on a bit, I think now is the time that people are wanting to hear those pitches for really African stories. And I think we can be bold enough to say, I really think we need to add a couple more zeros to that budget to make sure that we've got a team that are being raised up through the making of this. And I think you will be listened to, and I think the money will be signed off. So that's what I think.
Fingers crossed that the money is signed off. Thank you so much, Vanessa. Bradley, your one thing.
One thing for me is, there's a great opportunity that is currently unfolding or has unfolded. And that opportunity is that Africans telling African stories, and I think we haven't had that before, at least not a lot, at least not to the extent of the demand that I'm sensing through various conversations that I'm having. And I think development is key, and investing into, developing our create and developing our stories, because there's a great demand that is coming, and then coupled with that, is for the powers that be, whether it's government, arts and culture, whether it's the DTI, is to recognize the huge potential, that is there, and to help facilitate, the realization of that potential through the various structures that they have in place, and actually, seeing the film industry, the content industry, the creative industries, not only as a nice to have, but a fully fledged industry that can really create jobs, grow the economy, and make a difference to South Africans, and maybe not to see us as a nice to have being in entertainment industry. So the one thing that I'd like to see is focus on how we develop our stories, because the demand is growing on a daily basis for African stories told by Africans.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Bradley. Quinton, we did lose you earlier on when we were hearing from you around your points on new economic models that are developing that we can be using. And I think one of the big things you were saying there is the fact that co-creation is the key. Quinton, what is your final point on the one thing that needs to happen going forward?
Okay, so I think there's a couple of things that need to happen, but I can focus on 2 or 3. I think we need stability in the regulatory environment in terms of the rebate. I think we need an understanding in terms of agencies like the IDC and the National Empowerment Fund and other investment bodies in the country that the creative industries is a key growth area. And that's demonstrated in terms of the returns on investment that can be accrued if you do your planning, if you have enough investment in the development process, and you've got 5 or 6 or 10 drafts of the script, and you've got international mentorship and skilled creatives working with local talent. And then lastly, I think we do need stability in terms of our broadcaster, because if we're going to tell authentic indigenous stories and we're going to celebrate our diversity, as one of the panelists in Joburg was alluding to earlier on, then we need to stabilize that environment, and we need to recognize that investment in skills development is crucial to the growth of the talent pool and the producing pool that will allow us to grow the industry to a point where it can operate independently without outside investment. And then the last point I'd like to mention is the extension of the Section 12J tax incentive or tax rebate that is now going to expire, which has been a model that whereby high net worth individuals can invest as kind of angel investors in projects that are considered high risk by normal commercial investment agencies, but they get a significant tax rebate or a tax holiday for a period of up to 5 years. And I would like to see those kind of mechanisms guaranteed beyond the anticipated year of expiry that's currently being tabled by Treasury. So, yeah.
Yeah, that would be great to see. Thank you very much, Quinton. Isaac, what is your one thing that you think needs to happen going forward?
I think a lot of mine is similar to Bradley's. I think I'm having conversations and I'm seeing things that make me believe there's a wave coming our way as far as demand for the content that we're producing. I think we need to lead with content. So we need to, as producers, be developing and creating content to get ready for that. But more importantly, I think there's a huge opportunity now for the South African government to get ready for that wave. Because if we aren't ready here, if our house isn't ready, by the time it hits us, there's going to be hundreds of millions of dollars that could have come into our economy that won't, through original content, not even through servicing. So I think I'm excited about it. But I am also a little bit nervous that throughout the night, we've been hearing about all the different holes that have been popping up recently. Yeah. And I'm a little bit nervous that our infrastructure is kind of getting a little bit worn down. And I think specific focus needs to be given to all the different aspects as far as policy, implementation, especially reliability of the rebate and all of that kind of stuff before this thing is coming, before it hits us, because it is coming.
The house needs to be ready before the wave shows up, 100%.
Yeah.
Azania, your one thing?
Yeah, I echo everyone, and also Quinton. In terms of legislation, I think definitely our legislation has to be in order. We've got to get our copyright bill. We've got to sort that out. We've got to stabilize our incentives. We've got to be able to also promote ourselves to private investors. Don't be scared to ask for private money. There's a lot of private money out there. Just try and find it. The other thing is collaboration. We do need legislative cohesion, and what I mean by that, you need the provinces, national organizations, you need everyone kind of sitting around a room. I know that there's a South African forum of legislative environments, yes, but that kind of needs to really kick in now to be able to have a cohesive conversation, talk to each other, you know, around those issues. From a continental point of view as well, when we go out, yes, we must promote Africa as one unit that works together, but then you can have some form of competitive nuances within there. We have also, in terms of value chain, can we just really look at the value chain? I know we're producers in the space, right? But there's also opportunities for facilities. Can we find ways to infrastructure, build studios, build sound stages around the continent? People will scream and shout and say, we don't really need sound stages. Actually, yes, we do. Can we start to really look at the kind of what we have on the ground, empower that, start to make things ourselves and start to create from an innovation point of view. And I think also, we go out a lot, inbound. Let's do more inbound familiarization tours. Let people kind of come in and see how we are, what we taste like, what we smell like, what we feel like, all of those elements. Because once they come in and spend time with us, I know people spoke about them, a lot of people coming in, and I know that Vanessa said the same thing. It's just about amplifying that and saying, come and see us, spend time with us, speak to Katlego, speak to facility owners. Our studios, let us use them, let's empower them, let's promote them, those kind of elements. And also from a studio point of view, not just about the facility, but also the mindset of a studio, whereby you have a universal physical studio, but you also have universal as a script environment, to be able for us to build on our scripts and original content, is to then keep on promoting the locations that we have, so people to South Africa is our flag is the third best known flag in the world. I mean, use that, maximize that, but really it's about collaboration, inbound, and fixing our legislation, getting our house in order, ready for this wave, because I also feel the same wave coming through.
Fantastic. Katlego, do you have the same feel? What is your final thought?
Yeah, no, look, I think just like making it easier to make films, to make content. It seems like a lot of the talk around the policies and new legislation or proposed legislative changes sounds like it's things that might make it even more difficult. It's already difficult enough trying to raise money as it is. We don't make Seriously Single without the support of government and NVF and DTI. And especially as a young black company, it's when you don't have access to those private funds, you kind of need that support. Any change that comes and makes it even harder to start raising funds and start getting rights, etc., it's gonna make things worse for us. So I echo what everybody's saying in terms of we have to keep developing. We are already on a global stage, but that we won't be helped if whatever changes are coming through are not making it easier for us to be on that global stage.
Definitely. So make it more easy to do and not difficult, right? Because
Yeah,
we're already making good stuff. Help us to make it easier to make the good stuff. Thank you so much to our virtual panelists for joining us, and to my panelists in studio. Thank you very much for making the time to be with us this evening. I know we ran over because we had tech issues in the beginning, but thank you so much to everybody who is tuned in. And our program is a bit later in the evening, but we did that so that people in the UK and in the US, in Australia, would be able to join. So thank you so much to those audiences tuning in from everywhere across the world. You've heard the conversation. I do want to remind you that the audiovisual white paper is still open for comment. So please do, if you're part of the local scene, do write in. If you're part of an international scene and you're wanting to come into South Africa and invest, please do send your letters and send your contributions to make this an industry that we can all be a part of. And just wrapping up the conversation from today, we've heard a lot around the fact that we do need a supportive regulatory and legislative environment that creates a sustainable industry that can continue to grow and that is attractive to a lot of investment. We have a great country that's great for shooting films and so forth, but it's not just about the assets that we have. We really need to be able to attract the international investment. So from our conversation today, it's really going forward and making sure that those things happen, and we're not making it more difficult, but we're making it easier to grow our South African industry. Finally, I do want to give a big thank you to the Independent Producers Organization, the Independent Black Filmmakers Collective, the Commercial Producers Association of South Africa, DFA and Animation South Africa for coming together to make this possible. And a big thank you to the Academy of Sound Engineering for hosting us this evening. We really do appreciate it. Thank you so much. My name is Ntsiki Mkhize. It's been an absolute pleasure hosting you all. Keep well. Guys, thank you very much.